A very warm, sunny good morning to everyone. If I may have your attention. So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome once again. My name is Nxumalo. I will be chairing the session, and we are very pleased to be joined by the Minister this morning. Welcome to you. We have two very distinguished presenters on this morning's panel. Well, actually, we had three scheduled, but unfortunately, Dr. Mzala is unable to be with us, so his paper will be read. So we then have Dr. Nxumalo, who will be our first speaker, and then followed by Professor Vladimir Shubin. So it's my privilege to be chairing this session this morning, which is entitled Reconfiguration of Democracy in a Changing World. A very interesting theme, given the current state of affairs of our democracy in South Africa. So it'll be interesting to hear from our two speakers from both the local and international context regarding the state of democracy and how it could possibly be reconfigured. So can I just say 20 minutes for both presentations, and then we will have some discussion. Without further ado, let me start by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Nxumalo, who is also my former boss. So Dr. Nxumalo is the CEO of the Nxumalo Center. He holds 8 academic qualifications in political science, education, and history from South African universities and the US. Previously, he was a senior lecturer and academic leader at UKZN. He has published 3 books and several articles and presented over 80 academic papers nationally and internationally. So over to Dr. Nxumalo, who will be presenting on who owns and defines democracy, power dynamics, and the conceptualization of democracy in a constantly changing world.
Thank you very much, Comrade Nadbi. We used to fight battles together at UKZN, now you are on your own. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity. Some of us had to wake up very early because the media wanted to know a couple of things. April is a very important month, so to talk about Solomon Mahlangu, we're to talk about Chris Hani, and of course we're to talk about Mzala Nxumalo. Fortunately, then the media afforded us the opportunity to expand on some of the developments that have been taking place since Thursday. We really appreciate the opportunity. Now, in the context of Mzala being the person who has brought us together here, Derek, we are going to try and do some of the things he used to do, which is basically raising very critical questions on things that are taken for granted, and then trying to get the nation talking. I think somebody is trying to sabotage us here. As the advert goes, before we're interrupted. Okay, now, yeah, the title of my presentation is Who Owns and Defines Democracy? Power Dynamics and the Conceptualization of Democracy in a Constantly Changing World. I decided to coin my topic this way simply because we normally assume that democracy means the same thing to everyone. So that's the point I want to engage at this point. So this is how I've outlined my presentation, and I'm not going to go through these headings because they'll come up anyway during the course of my presentation. But maybe as a point of departure, I start by saying that there is a general belief that democracy as a form of rule is universal. This is a general assumption, and almost everyone claims that he or she knows what democracy is. However, the very ubiquity of the term, finding it everywhere, means that this has also rendered it meaningless, in the sense that you find it almost everywhere. Just like rights, people in South Africa seem to be using Chapter 2 of the Constitution in a rather very awkward manner. Even if you kill someone, then you say it was my right to do that. So basically, the ubiquity then of this concept democracy has rendered it meaningless. So then we have to try and interrogate it. Secondly, I say for this reason, democracy is perceived to be a myth and not something real which you can lay your hands on. The term's complexity arises in part from the fact that its tenets or characteristic features, in fact, can be traced in different governance systems, including those we consider to be undemocratic. In other words, you take an undemocratic institution, you analyze it, you will find that there are some characteristic features that would neatly fit under what we end up defining as democracy. A case in point, for instance, is Tinkolja in Swaziland, a point I will mention later in the course of this discussion. And the binary question I'm asking, therefore, is who owns and defines democracy? Who has the right to define democracy for us? Put differently, the question becomes, whose version of democracy should prevail and why? Because if I define it my own way, and Professor Shubin defines his own way, then whose version should see the light of the day? And lastly, it is correct to, is it correct to institute a regime change under the guise of democracy? We've seen this happening across the globe, where some countries seem to be taking democracy from wherever it is and then transporting it to other countries. And then these questions are asked against the backdrop that some states embrace and export their version of democracy using one of the two forms, either through persuasion or through coercion. Either way, they say they are transporting democracy. Now, with regards to the conceptualization of democracy, its tenets, as well as its origin or different origins, then I'll run through a few points. One is that democracy is a very complex phenomenon with a long history. Scholars of democracy refer to its tenets, but do not have a definitive meaning for it. In other words, they will tell you these are the characteristics of a democratic state, but they won't tell you for sure what it exactly is, except that we have some common definitions which you don't necessarily have to take at face value. And the next point I make then is that historically the term democracy was first used by Herodotus, a Greek historian, way back in the 5th century BC. To do that, he brought together two words. One was demos, meaning the people, and the other one was kratein, meaning rule. In other words, the assumption here, or the implicit assumption, was that democracy was the rule by the people. Whether you agree with this or not, then that's a story for another day. Abraham Lincoln then seemed to subscribe to this notion of democracy because he defined it as government of the people, by the people, for the people. And I think some of us may have heard this definition several times. It reverberates in a number of lecture rooms when people teach politics 101, politics 102, whatever the case is. So this is what has been taken as the true definition of democracy, whatever true means in this context. Until the end of the 18th century, almost all definitions of democracy focused on one type of democracy, that is direct democracy. We'll come to the other form. Now, this form of democracy is called participatory democracy, whereby people are directly involved in the decision making. In other words, they take part in determining their fate. They do this, among other things, by attending public meetings and, of course, having a say in a referendum. But in the current political dispensation, this is no longer possible. In the past, it was possible because in ancient Greece, for instance, in Athens, with a population of about 45,000. So it was easy to form a quorum having just 6,000 people. That is not possible today. You can't bring over 54 million people together and say, each one of you must have a say. For that reason, then, it meant that democracy to undergo some changes. The democracy of the ancient Greek, as some others say, that is city-state, consisted not only in the rule according to the wishes of the majority of the people, but also in the actual participation of the people themselves. In other words, people directly participated in the deliberations that were taking place. Then as population increased, then it meant that direct democracy was no longer feasible. Then with another form of democracy, that is indirect democracy. This one took shape in the Middle Ages, and then of course has been widely used subsequently. When this type of democracy rose into prominence, authors such as John Stuart Mills averred that it was the ideal type of perfect government. Whether then you consider that ideal that's another discussion. But some philosophers like Aristotle and Plato said, no, you know what? For this kind of democracy to work, you must have philosophers at the top, and then everybody else must be underneath. So already there was a problem as to who will have a say in what constitutes this type of democracy. Now, the question I have is, what about African governance systems? Where do they feature in this discussion? What about Nkundla in Swaziland? Where does it feature here? And what about no-party democracy coined by President Yoweri Museveni in Uganda? If then we say we have a particular understanding of democracy, obviously then we will be saying all of these other forms of democratic processes do not apply because there is a version of democracy that has been accepted. So that is the premise from which I'm moving. Now, usually what happens then if you write a paper or you do a research project, they say find a theoretical framework. And usually most of these theoretical frameworks come from somewhere. Luckily, Comrade Navi, of the 10 students that have been supervising at UKZN that are graduating this year, one of them in fact used Ubuntu as a theory. And I argued why that theory has a place under the theoretical framework. But for the purpose of this presentation, I decided to use the theory that most of us would know. That is the theory that determines how states operate. In this case, I said the purpose of a theory is to locate a study in a broader context. And Michel makes the point that we should preferably, we must, but we should preferably associate a research project with a specific theory for the reason stated in bullet 1. And this paper, therefore, is grounded under the theory called realism or traditionalism, which is the traditional school of international relations theory. In essence, this theory is state-centric. In other words, it means that according to the realism theory, the state is the core. Everything that happens revolves around the state. You can come up with other things, but then everything will have to revolve around the state. As such, your non-governmental organizations, your church-based organizations, your international organizations are important, but they are not as important as the state. That is what realism says. Realists believe that all states live under constant fear of attack by others. In other words, if you are a state, we are always in constant fear that you might be attacked at any time. So therefore, you have to always be alert. That's why all countries have the Minister of Defense, even if you don't have an enemy that you are looking at. So basically, it's based on that particular theory. Then, when states decide what to do in order to protect themselves, they choose between two types of realism. One is offensive realism, and the other one is defensive realism. Some people believe that if you want to be safe, a strike before your enemy does that. And others say, no, just defend yourself once you've been attacked. I remember in 2003, George W. Bush had his own ultimatum on Saddam Hussein. But before that ultimatum date came, he then attacked. When he was asked, but then why did you attack? Because the deadline did not come. And then he called it, somebody helped him coin a term, a decapitation mission. He said, I saw an opportunity, then I acted. So basically, he was opting to, one of these offensive or defensive realism. Now, exporting democracy, regime change, and power dynamics. The argument I'm making here is that exporting democracy revolves around power dynamics, because whoever has the power to define democracy in a particular way feels obligated to then export that defined democracy to other states using either persuasion or coercion. So that is in that context that I have this section here. And I'm using America as an example, not to say America is the only country, it's just that America is replete with examples to make my point clear. The concept of exporting democracy is gradually finding its place in the vocabulary on international relations. And similarly, regime change literature has also increased significantly in the past couple of years. And then I cite some of those sources where you find this kind of debate or discussion. And the nodal point for me, therefore, between these is that you have power dynamics at play. In other words, whoever defines democracy and then subsequently exports it will then draw from the power that he or she has amassed. And this power can come from either political power, economic power, or financial power, and in some instances also diplomatic power. But either way, we have some form of power at play. Those countries with military and economic power feel obligated to export their version of democracy and to institute regime change in countries that seem powerless or are perceived to be deviant. Those who have done psychology will know what deviant behavior is all about. So you basically don't do what everybody else is doing, doing something totally different, and then you must be brought in line. So basically, some people then would export democracy with the view that they want to deal with deviant behavior, or the assumed deviant behavior. America has taken the lead in this regard, using brute force to export its version of democracy and to enforce regime change in a number of countries. Then the question is why? I've answered this question by providing 4 answers. One answer is that America is doing this simply because of political arrogance. That is one reason for me America has done that. And America feels that it is a superpower and therefore should dictate terms and decide which version of democracy is the best, and then which countries must embrace that kind of democracy. To achieve this goal, its leaders use the carrot and stick approach. They either entice you as a country to adopt their version of democracy, or they threaten you, and in a worst case scenario, they attack you, and then of course, eventually they eliminate you. Either way, that is political arrogance. Regime change has happened in a number of countries then under the US. You have Afghanistan, you have Iraq, and then of course recently you have Libya. Muammar Gaddafi is no longer with us. Saddam Hussein is no longer with us. The Taliban government was dealt with, and that was a way of exporting a particular version of democracy. The second reason, of course, is subscription to realism. I'm not going to spend much time here because I've already defined what realism is all about. So basically, the point I'm making is one of the reasons why America is exporting its version of democracy is because it subscribes to the notion of realism, saying that you have to defend yourself by preventing a problem before it arises. That's why you manufacture facts and say Saddam Hussein has stashed weapons of mass destruction, which are non-existent. And then, of course, at the end of the day, nothing will happen. And you bypass the UN, by the way, and claim to be applying Resolution 1441, which is not the case. And because under realism, state matters more than international institutions. Don't ask me why the UN didn't take the Americans to task for their actions in Iraq, because I was not there. But the other reason, of course, that there is a sense of entitlement based on history. America feels obligated that as a superpower, it has to export its version of democracy. The American people fought for their independence, and then, of course, it took them over a generation to successfully build foundations of democracy, and therefore they claim that they have experience on democracy and they are best qualified to export it to other countries. Now, a question was asked one time, how well did the US import its brand of democracy? And the answer provided by Woolley and Perigo is that the founding fathers inherited a suite of centuries-old institutions and traditions from Imperial Britain. The Magna Carta, habeas corpus, a parliamentary system that evolved through the English Civil War and Restoration, the Bill of Rights, a liberal international order already in the making, protected sea lanes, security from external threat, a spirit of commercialism, individualism, and rationality, and a gentrified political class able to travel in politics and ideas. So basically, the simple point made here is that America seems to be of the view that when they got introduced into the democratic ethos, they then spent time trying to understand it up to the point that they are now quote-unquote experts, and therefore they are better qualified to export it. And then the last reason is a response to a decline view. There is a view which says that America has rivals who are gradually growing signs of rising up, and America is not impressed. Because if you've been occupying a particular sport and you've been the key man or the key woman, whatever the case is, and suddenly you have a contender, then you must be restless. And that is what is happening. China is making inroads in a number of continents, including Africa, We have BRICS, which is, of course, trying to disturb most of what was accepted as the way to go. And then we have the EU also doing its own things. And then America is not impressed. And therefore, it has to act. And part of acting then means exporting democracy into other countries. And to many, the fear and responsibility that drive American power and interests seem self-inflicted. In other words, America is a victim of its own circumstances. At the end of the Cold War, America emerged as a superpower, and therefore it feels like it's under pressure to act differently from other states which are defined as less powerful. If you look at some of the writings of Joseph Nye, he makes the point that American economic and cultural power will decline somewhat during the course of the present century. And now, if indeed this is about to happen, America is to take precautionary measures, which includes then, of course, making its presence felt. Woolley and Perrigan make the view that there is a sense that America has lost its leadership role. That is not doing a good job to one of its historic competencies, which is managing. So for quite some time, America is said to have been managing the world. And now it seems like this power is slipping away, and America is having sleepless nights, and therefore is acting in a frantic manner. As a loss of power, a loss of power manifests in a loss of relevance. Once you have no power, then you lose relevance, because people focus elsewhere. And then America would not be happy with that, therefore they have to take precautionary measures. Towards the end, Chair, is democracy a panacea to global challenges? We can answer this question in different ways, and we can provide reasons for our answers. But for me, I decided to start off by saying democracy is hailed as the best governance system by those who believe in it. Its adversaries perceive it differently. So in other words, all I'm saying is, as much as the majority of us as a human race believe that democracy is the best governance system, this doesn't mean that this is the same response we'll find from everyone. Because there are people who still believe that democracy is in fact not the answer to all our problems. Since its first adoption in different countries, democracy has undergone different phases, or has gone through different phases. And therefore, in each phase, there are supporters and there are those who accuse it of doing the opposite of what it is meant to achieve. There are different types of democracy, which makes it difficult to have a universal definition. So we have different definitions, but the question is whose definition then should prevail. Some countries use both persuasion and coercion to export their own version of democracy. And then having a democratic system does not in itself eliminate all problems that the human race faces. Based on this, I am of the view that democracy is not a panacea to global challenges. It is just one of the systems that we could use. In conclusion, no one can claim ownership of democracy. Secondly, this is so because there are different types of democracy. This makes it difficult to have a universal definition of the concept acceptable to everyone. Thirdly, tenets or characteristic features of what is referred to as democracy can be traced in different governance systems, both traditional and modern. And then, of course, to a large degree, democracy cannot be discussed outside of power dynamics because it all revolves around power. Who has the power? And then exporting democracy to other countries and forcing regime change epitomizes political arrogance and has a negative impact on international relations. Like all governance systems, democracy benefits some and not others. And then it should be perceived as just another system of governance, but not the only form which will solve the world's problems. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nxumalo, for that. What I take from that is that you have to believe in democracy in order for it to work, possibly. Thank you. What we will do is have all of the three presentations and then take questions at the end. So, please start noting down your questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Vladimir Shubin, who is our next presenter. He's a Principal Research Fellow of the Institute for African Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's published over 250 articles, book chapters, and reviews in the areas of international relations, history, and political studies. He's also the author of 7 books, including in English, Social Democracy and Southern Africa, and ANC, A View from Moscow, and The Hot Cold War, and an editor of a dozen books. So over to you, Professor Shubin.
So, dear friends, first of all, of course, many thanks for the invitation, for the possibility to be here. Before describing the subject I have chosen, I want to say some general words. I think that also because our conference of Coloquium is coming to the end, I think it was very good, though not subject which we're supposed to cover, we covered. I believe that one thing which is, sorry, I'm speaking very informally, see, I'm not supposed to criticize my host, that's it. One of the subjects was the prospects for socialism in South Africa. I have not heard much about it. About end of capitalism, post-capitalism, people mentioned, but what's next, I don't think it was discussed. And the second observation, I will come back to it a bit later. We discussed gender, we discussed race, but not much of class. Even my good friend on the left was speaking, America is doing this, America doing that. But what classes in America? What forces in America doing it? See? This is one of the points. As to my presentation, I have chosen as a part of one of the 5 themes which were in the invitation letter. The theme was global perspectives and local context. So I called my paper Emerging Powers in a Polycentric World, and I think I should start with explaining what does it mean. I put emerging powers in inverted commas. And that's deliberately because I think this very expression, this very phrase is expression of Eurocentrism. So if somebody believes that China did not exist and just imagine, or India for that matter, for Russia, which is in the old form existed also for about at least 12th century, that would be very wrong, you see. As if they only existed and we are just coming up now, you see. The same applies to the emerging economies. Yesterday I saw on TV here they speak about emerging markets as if there was no markets before, etc., etc. And the second part of my title is Polycentric World. It's something new. I can't say I like it very much, but they say, I'm not an engineer or physician, but they say, yeah, sorry. But they say that that formula which we used to use, multipolar, unipolar, bipolar, from the natural science is wrong, because there should be only 2 poles, you see. Therefore, I have to swallow this term polycentric, but meanwhile, just for convenience, in my presentation, I have used those multipolarity, unipolarity, etc. So let's come to this very point, you see. Yeah, okay, sorry. I can speak without mic if you want.
No, use the mic.
We used to call it commander's voice. So, the world, you see, the usual approach is the world was bipolar during so-called Cold War, then it became unipolar. Some people think it must become multipolar, etc. We must go a bit back and to see what does it mean, the Cold War. When did it start? I will not go into details, there is no time. But I remember when my old, good, senior friend, Comrade Brian Bunting, used to say that the Cold War started soon after the revolution in Russia in 1917. As soon as the foreign intervention, now forgotten, there were intervention of 14 countries against Soviet Russia, and civil war was over, he believes that Cold War started there. Some other people believe it started immediately after the Second World War. How did it end? Many people say, of course, even we have this notorious person. They say, don't say bad about the dead people, but I have to say that Igor Gaidar, who was prime minister under Yeltsin, he said we lost the Cold War, they were suffering when he was trying to explain the destruction of economy by themselves. But, yeah, I would comment, you know, there was a very good man, Evgeny Primakov, who died, who was also prime minister. He said that during those reforms in the 90s, we lost more than twice more than during the Nazi occupation of part of the Soviet Union and the war. You see, the destruction was even worse than in 41 or 42. But I believe, yeah, now in the States, some people say, some academics, that we all lost Cold War. In my opinion, there was some kind of ceasefire during Gorbachev period, so-called, some compromises, some agreements, not all of them in our favor, but still. And then one side made a very big surprise, they committed a suicide. That's our side, or to be more exact, the leaders of the day in the Soviet Union, Yeltsin, Gorbachev and company, they committed this suicide. What happened later? They say they will become unipolar, but let's look a bit deeper again. You see, in my opinion, the so-called bipolar world existed only in the 50s and maybe mid-60s, up to mid-60s. After the revolution in China, when we have an alliance with China between Moscow and Beijing, and up to 60s, because somewhere 63, 65, when there were serious problems between Soviet Union and China, so-called Soviet-China conflicts, etc. So you could not, if you take in the military sense, from that period, the world was of course was already multipolar, because there was no alliance between us and China. Even worse, in 69 there were some skirmishes on the border. In Europe, if you remember, General de Gaulle withdrew France from the military organization of NATO. They remained as members of NATO, but they left the military bloc. Even the headquarters will have to leave Paris for Belgium. In economic side, you remember there was a rise of Japan, then there was a serious rise in Europe, including creation of European Economic Community, then European Union, etc. So it's also was difficult to speak about just bipolar world. Now, in political side, let's not forget about the non-aligned movement. It's almost forgotten now, but it was a very strong movement. Of course, half at least of the world countries were there, and some of them were closer to the Soviet Union, for example, like Cuba. Some of them were closer to the United States, like Indonesia after the 1965 coup, but still it was a very, very strong movement. Just a point of information is you must study history properly. It's very difficult to find sources. But Kwame Nkrumah went to Belgrade to the first conference of non-aligned movement in the Soviet plane with the Soviet crew. But that's another story. And that's my opinion. So multipolar world did exist early. The only point I would agree that there was a bipolarity in the sense of two major social, political, maybe ideological systems. But there was a lot of diffusions within those systems, you see. So the problem for me, I think now, is not to create multipolar world, but to protect the multipolar world. Again, my colleague here spoke about the leadership role of the United States, but who gave them this leadership? And leadership in what sense, you see? You know that they owe a lot of money to China, they owe a lot of money to Russia, and we unfortunately still buying their bonds, etc., etc. Recently, speaking from memory, I think 5 billion were spent again recently, helping the economy. There is a strong feeling in Russia that we must stop helping American economy. And that's the situation for today. I believe that makes us a bit more optimistic than usually. One point just about democracy. Look, we have very good relations with Ethiopia. In the previous composition of parliament, there was one non-ruling party member. He was independent. After election, there is none. They call it multi-party democracy. Okay. Now, about the correlation between internal policy and foreign policy. I will try to say something about South Africa, though, of course, it's not my mission. Maybe the colleagues will correct me. And then about Russia. Officially, the ANC in the documents classify itself as characterized a multi-class organization. Multi-class organization of anti-imperialist nature. And I believe it's very important to make, not now, but maybe it's one of even of the directions of your future research in this center, to look what classes are there, or rather what parts of what classes are there. You see, and allow me to quote from the person who is not often quoted now, Paula Jordan. In 1997, before the ANC Congress, in his paper called The Nation Question Post-1994, he said, since 1994, the multi-class character of ANC itself is undergoing transformation. Whereas in the past, there was no captains of industry in the leading organ of the ANC, today, at least one NEC member heads one of the largest conglomerate trading on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, etc., etc. I don't know whether it's still one person or zero or more, but to understand the policy, I think we must look on the social structures. And I think to some extent social structures are changing. And without this, it's very difficult to understand why this or this thing happened. And sorry, I have neither wish nor, how to say, right to interfere in your domestic affairs, but I don't believe that the problem should be, and successes maybe, should be reduced to one person. It's much more serious, and we have to see to the social side of them. That question, again, a bit maybe dangerous. They say about social cohesion. But is social cohesion possible in the class society? If possible, to some extent. Where the interests coincide, where they differ. All this, I think, needs a proper discussion, proper research. The next point is almost forgotten. I hardly heard it here. It's class struggle. It's not very fashionable. People don't say much about class struggle. But if it's a multi-class society, so there should be other class branch or class struggle within a multi-class society, within multi-class organization. And here allow me to quote from very different sources. One of the biggest American tycoons, Warren Buffett. He is not shy. He said there is a class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we are winning. That's his, and we are shy sometimes to say that we're also involved. You see? Now some words about Russia, you see. Professor Vasiliev, who was for over 20 years director of our institute, which I belong to, Institute of African Studies, now he's honorary president, thanks God he's still very much alive, said in one of the, about 10 years ago, Russia is a split society. There exist various social groups, or if you wish, class interests, he's also a bit Vasiliev, which are reflected in its foreign policy. Quite real interests of certain social groups, which became a part of Russian economic and political elites, I heard about elites, by the way, caused a chimerical orientation to integration with the West. They are exporters of raw materials, big financial speculators, who export a considerable part of their capitals to the West. It remains, but not to that degree. Also, there is a class struggle, or should I say interclass struggle, even within Russian society, between different groups of bourgeoisie, and that group which was openly pro-Western, they are losing. They have not lost, but they are losing. And it is reflected in the political composition, say, of the parliament called State Duma. The openly pro-Western parties are not there. They lost. There was 5% minimum. They never got 5% minimum. And we had local elections. Maybe there were too many, what we call it politely, administrative measures. The electoral commissions were too strict in registration. But in one of the provinces, when they registered, they got 2.8% of votes. That's their authority. Though the international so-called mass media will see a lot about opposition in Russia. There is opposition, but it's on the left. That's a real opposition, but not much on the right. Now, I believe that the foreign policy of our two countries are quite similar. You see, there are some problems like question of landmines, different pace of United Nations reform, but what is lacking, it's correlations on the people's level. The government relations are good, but almost nothing else. To a large extent, it's our fault because in 22 years of democracy here, we never opened single cultural center, as a country in South Africa. And the results are bad. Recently, there was a so-called, there was this Pew Agency or Pew Corporation in America, some organization which are making polls. And the poll showed that only 25% of Africans think positively about Russia. 35 in Kenya, 45 in Nigeria, over 50% in Ghana. Frankly, it's a bit strange because maybe it's a result of this old propaganda, but it's already 20 years. I believe to a large extent it's a result of the mass media. You people are listening, reading newspapers more than some other African countries. You people watching TV more. And the whole information comes from the West, from the very unreliable and wrong sources. But in Russia it's not much better because, unfortunately, our mass media are not our mass media. The latest figure, 62%, it was 2 years back. 62% of the Russian mass media belong not to Russian citizens. Fortunately, last year the new law was, except I think by 1917 it should be reduced to 20 or 25%. I don't remember exactly. Maybe the situation will be better, but otherwise also there is a lot of nonsense written, especially by so-called liberals. As we discussed, as we mentioned yesterday, this Locke was racist, as you know. And these liberals in our country, they're very much racist, though they speak about human rights. Then in the break I can give you some example. I don't want to waste time, I'm already out of time. But a couple of words with your permission, chairperson, yeah? Yeah. Colored Revolution, since I mentioned yesterday, it's a special subject, but in what they call regime change. Today in the morning I was watching TV, as you know, very interesting, maybe two TOO interesting developments there. A Frank Chicano is saying, no, it's not a regime change we want. So even the term regime change already appeared here. And they started speaking about some elements of colored revolution before what was mentioned. The colored revolution, of course, they are very different in different countries. And they cannot take place without developments within the country. You cannot just bring them from outside. The external influence is very important, sometimes external pressure, but only when the situation is out of control in the country, they could happen. And the best proof of it is Syria. For 5 years they were trying to suppress the Syrian regime or Syrian government, they could not make it. If there were no support of the people, they could do it easily. And the whole propaganda is against them, but Syria is an excellent country, but that I can discuss separately. Okay, 2 words about Arab Spring, you see. They said a sweeping wave of democracy. First of all, it was not so sweeping. Practically so-called regime change happened in Libya because of NATO aggression, criminal aggression. Partly in Yemen, because vice president became president, now he's fighting president, it still continues. No, in Tunisia, with some detour to Islamism and then back to democracy, if you call it democracy. That's all. And not very democratic, as you know. Nothing special, nothing became more democratic. Egypt, big question mark. Okay, they toppled what they call Ikhwan, these Muslim brothers, but they came technically democratically to power, like Hitler in '63. So the comparison. Yeah, and the last point, maybe no, 2 more points. BRICS, it's a separate thing which needs also proper discussion. There are now, it's interesting, here in your country, they criticize from the left or from the right. I don't want to blame to brand the people. It's very easy to put the label and very difficult to erase it later. But there was recently a serious article from this Institute of Security Studies, Jackie Sealers, critical. On the other side, my old friend, not old, Patrick Bond criticizing it from left or ultra-left position, and it survived. Yes, in the beginning it was mostly economic organization. Its strength was in its growth, tremendous growth of those countries. Now the situation is much worse, at least in Brazil and in Russia. But they managed already to create, as they call it, multi-sectoral system of relationship, which is sustainable, sustain itself. There are joint interests. It's not confrontation with the rest, but at least defense of national interests. And to prove at least that BRICS will survive, we already announced in Russia that the next meeting in Russia will take in 2020 in the city of Chelyabinsk, that's South Ural. I would put it further east to Siberia, but still it's all right. Still it's all right. And the very last point, sorry once again. We have good political relations. We have weak economic relations between our countries. We have very weak cultural relations. And allow me to be just a bit critical. We are not studying South Africa properly, but at least we have something in our country. Here, 25 years ago, 3 or 4 institutions, centers or departments existed which study Russia. Now there is 0. So, now there is 0. We are trying to do something. I am glad to say that we started now some project, 5 young chaps and 1 old man, which is called South Africa, a strategic partner of Russia. It's 3 years project, apart from other normal activities of ours. And I hope that within this project we also have a chance to cooperate with different institutions, including, of course, Mzala Center. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Shubin. I think wonderful multiple perspectives from an international relations point of view. So this brings us to the next presentation. Now, the presenter is unfortunately not with us today, Dr. Ivo Mandaza, but I believe that his paper will be read by Professor Robert Bell. Is that correct? Thank you. And so just very briefly, yes, please come through. Just to give you an idea of Dr. Mandaza's background. He's a Zimbabwean academic, author and publisher, holds a doctorate of philosophy in political economy from the University of York in England. He has researched and written extensively on issues of governance, international relations and public policy, and was one of the first senior African civil servants in post-independent Zimbabwe, having been a member of the Zimbabwe National Liberation Movement in the Department of Research, Education and Manpower, ZANU headquarters, Maputo, Mozambique. So with that, I will hand over to Professor Ball to kindly read his paper, which is entitled, well, it should be confirmed, the title, but it's on there. Thank you.
Thanks. It's Ball 4.
Thank you.
Colleagues, I'm sorry that this comes to you in the form that it does. It's actually a very long chapter, a good 30 pages or so. I've had to kind of slash and burn as I go through it. It might have an impact on the coherence of the work, but I'll do my best. It's necessary to explain why, and the title of the paper is The Political Economy of the State of Zimbabwe, the Rise and Fall of the Security State. It begins with an extract from Willie Mutunga's book, in which he describes the presidency and the dominance of the kind of big man in African states, with reference to Robert Mugabe in particular. And he begins with saying, it's necessary to explain why, notwithstanding the best of constitutions, including the Zimbabwean one, which was signed into law in 2013, why there has so far remained a very elusive democratic exercise in Zimbabwe in relation to the implementation of the constitution. For always implicit but seldom explicit in the discourse on political processes and transitions to post-colonial states and democracies, there is an implicit subscription to a bourgeois, or notion of a bourgeois democracy, with its origins in the European Westphalian state, finding its contemporary expression in the African context in the nationalist struggle for independence and the establishment of the nation-state in the making at independence, with all the requisite trappings of a constitutional democracy in a community of nations as represented by the United Nations and other international organizations. So central to the bourgeois democracy model, or to use the term which connotes the same, the national democratic revolution, are the following: the constitution as the supreme law of the land, the strong emphasis on the separation of powers between the executive, legislature, and judiciary, as the guarantee of the rule of law, the basic freedoms for all citizens, the genuine democratic discourse, which includes the establishment and maintenance of national institutions that are simultaneously non-partisan and conducive to nation building, and an enlightened leadership in the absence of the conventional national bourgeoisie, that is the anchor class in contemporary Western bourgeois societies, can be the driving force, he argues, for the political and socio-economic development of the post-colonial dispensation. So there are various concepts that have emerged among progressive African scholars in particular as part of the quest for a unique African epistemology, but also reflecting a recent past, the 1970s and the 1980s, when the development debate in Africa was centered on the presumed choice between capitalism and socialism. Hence, he argues the less precise concept of the developmental state came into being. More latterly, the more dynamic concept of the developmental democracy has come into play. And both of these, he suggests, explain the contemporary African reality of essentially the struggle for a bourgeoisie, democracy, and economic development in an era dominated by international capital, neoliberalism, and a relentless globalization, which has virtually relegated, he suggests, sub-Saharan Africa to the status of an extractive industry bulb. For primary products, which was also alluded to in some of yesterday's discussion, bereft of any industrial capacity and therefore destined for a cycle of unemployment, poverty, and underdevelopment. The author then goes on to talk about other examples in Africa, looking at Kwame Nkrumah and the beginnings of democracy in that context, and then, of course, looking at the Chief Justice's pronouncements in Zimbabwe, that's William Tunga, about this notion of the big man as a glaring symbol of the failure of constitutional democracy and constitutionalism as an idea. Needless to say, the constitutional provisions, the 2013 constitution in Zimbabwe, have become a virtual necessity in constitution-making processes in South Africa, so in Southern Africa and Africa. So he suggests that no shortage of examples of constitution-making in Africa, but the real issues don't tend to be about the making of constitutions, they tend to be about the limits of presidential terms and about the inability to translate constitutions into the value system of particularly the bourgeoisie in these states. And he uses the example of Yoweri Museveni, now in power since 1986, who asserted arrogantly that we do not believe in term limits. If you don't want them to be there forever, you vote them out. But this was the same man who, taking office about 30 years ago, said the problem of Africa in general, and referred to Uganda in particular, is not that the people don't vote, but that leaders don't want to lead and overstay. So, looking at other recent examples of constitution making, notably Rwanda and the Congo Republic, he notes that these constitutions have allowed their leaders to seek third terms, and there have been continued problems around other heads of state insisting on third and fourth terms, and there he's looking particularly at the example of Burundi. So the argument really, then, he says, the burden of incumbency, presidential incumbency in Africa, has less to do with personality in his view, and more to do with the nature of this animal called the post-colonial state, or the colonial inheritance, the continuity of the key pillars of that colonial state in the transition to independence and after, with the petite bourgeoisie and the emergent comprador bourgeoisie, the class that inherited state power at independence, a class that, unlike the conventional national bourgeoisie in other democracies, is not grounded in the economy and production, and therefore is kind of perpetually, parasitically dependent on the state for access to wealth and primitive accumulation. So that the link between the bourgeoisie and state power is so close as to not allow the proper development of constitutionalism to occur in the African context. And he said this leads to kind of series of what he calls primitive accumulation and predatory type activities that are characteristic of this social formation, the post-colonial nascent democratic political formation. And he says these are excesses which in turn reveal a level of political insecurity and paranoia and fear of an uncertain future for the self, for the family at the very atomistic level, should people in power relinquish office. And I think we see that quite often around the world in relation to presidential families. Elsewhere, he says, we have sought to establish a relationship between the African nationalist ideology of class that inherits power and independence on the one hand, and on the other hand, the failure to transform the economic and social structures of the state on the other. He says this was an ideology founded on two interrelated neoliberal themes: an implicit faith in Western values, Western institutional arrangements, and the related paraphernalia, including cultural, ceremonial, even judicial garb, presidential garb. Therefore, he says that the bourgeoisie state model in the African nationalist terms inherit with political independence much of those associations of the Western democratic state, but without the evidence of a proper bourgeoisie in place to contest and balance state power. Add to this the extent to which the Western value system is taken for granted, unproblematically, as an integral part of any dispensation that the African nationalists would one day seek to have established in their countries, and how African nationalist leaders, including those who remain in our midst, are so much creatures of a colonial system that has left an indelible mark on their thought processes, also their lives and aspirations. So the vision for democratic society in African states in which the violations and demands of the colonial era would become a thing of the past in place of a new meritocracy has not come to be realized. As is the case in post-colonial Africa in general, and Zimbabwe is his particular example, it says Zimbabwe has demonstrated a glaring economic and political incapacity to fulfill its vision. Unlike the conventional bourgeois state after which it was modeled, in the pursuit of independence, the nation-state in the making in Zimbabwe lacks the economic foundations and the anchor, which is what he terms the national bourgeoisie in particular, through which to adhere a commendable level of national confidence, national project interests, and create a national economy. Hence the continued hegemony of parasitic and comprador classes, most of whose members have grown in this post-colonial situation and have developed a kind of pathology, and are largely dependent, he says, he made that point earlier, upon the state. They're dependent upon international capital or institutionalized aid regimes, and then unpacks what he calls a narrative within this, describing this pathology. I then want to skip a little bit and go on to a section of the chapter entitled Continuity, as opposed to transformation of the inherited colonial state. It begins thus: 30 years since the publication of Zimbabwe, the Political Economy, it is now more obvious why the term transition and not transformation was used by the authors of that publication to characterize Zimbabwe's political and economic process. Some of us had had exposure to, as exiles, to the realities of the post-colonial situations in Botswana, Zambia, and Mozambique, and African scholarship had by that time in the 80s sufficiently analyzed and exposed the nature and content of the post-colonial state, and 6 years after independence, the myth of the Southern African exceptionalism, the view underpinning the revolutionary rhetoric of the liberation struggle of Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and indeed South Africa, that the protracted struggle would naturally adhere in a transformative post-liberation process. He says this myth had been exposed, and the book illustrates as much. And he says that that has in fact belied the continuity associated with Zimbabwe's independence, making it more of a post-colonial state than a truly independent national state. So he says it's no longer possible to underestimate the nearly universal and hegemonic parameters of the bourgeois state model and its accompanying neoliberal ideology, in today's terms, constraining and thereby delaying the historically inevitable explosion of the contradictions that constitute modern-day capitalism. So is there, for the time being, an alternative, he questions, for the nation-states in the making, such as Zimbabwe, to the pursuit of the bourgeois democracy model as it is implicit in the struggle for political and economic reform of the post-colonial state? And he proceeds to try and kind of answer these questions. As pointed out in the foregoing, the distinguishing feature between other post-colonial situations and the Zimbabwe case is that the latter state was able to combine itself both the inherited structures of the colonial order and a former guerrilla army whose leadership worked hand in glove with its civilian counterparts, not only in developing the bureaucracy that is now so self-evident today, but also as part of the comprador bourgeoisie. The backdrop of a bloody armed struggle in which a number of its survivors still constitute a significant, if not central factor in the securocrat state, and the ideological rhetoric that has accompanied and sought to pervade the post-independence period to this very day, contribute towards the attempt to sustain and justify the twin pillars of contemporary securocracy in Zimbabwe, violence being the one pillar, or the threat of violence, and entitlement and patronage being the other pillar. And both of these, the violence and the patronage, have as integral to them, he suggests, an endemic, what he terms an endemic corruption and blatant looting of state resources. A very interesting point. The second point he makes in relation to the question he asks is the nature and development of the class that inherits power and independence in Zimbabwe. So how might we describe that class that inherits power? Inheriting a bourgeois state model without a national bourgeoisie is the problem. As has been explained elsewhere, the nature and impact of white settler colonialism in Zimbabwe and elsewhere in southern Africa directly impeded and preempted the development of an indigenous national bourgeoisie. The combination of this historical backdrop and the absence of a national bourgeoisie in the context of relentless globalization has virtually killed the prospects, he suggests, of a post-colonial and neo-colonial economy from ever ceasing to exist because of that continued relationship of dependence being formed. And it results in the ever-producing or the ever-diminishing of the emergence of any kind of middle class in these societies with the passage of time. He suggests that this is replaced by a predatory and parasitic class rather than a national bourgeoisie, and he describes this as the comprador bourgeoisie, which straddles both the public and the private sector. So in its dependence on state organs and its dependence on state capital, if you like, this class of people straddle both the public and the private sector. As the term implies, the comprador bourgeoisie in Zimbabwe is a class not rooted in production. So I think this is the distinguishing line he draws throughout the paper. Instead, it thrives, this particular class, on backhanders, factoral wars, for crooked contracts and shady deals, official corruption and looting of state coffers. And the origins of that class are to be found in African nationalism. So this is not this is a very interesting point. You also pick it up in texts by other scholars in Africa, like Mondani, itself. And the class ambitions, as already explained, and the class frustrations to become a national bourgeoisie are part of the ongoing kind of debates internal to this particular group of people dependent on state aid, dependent on state capital, but unable, in a sense, to distance themselves from those forms of dependence. So in such historical circumstances, the African nationalist leaders and their class associates were always, he says, very easy prey for international capital and its quest for new representatives and agents for its enterprises in the post-colonial dispensation. So the weakness of the bourgeoisie, the onset of globalization, the dependence on state organs and state capital make the leadership also vulnerable to further exploitation globally. So I think that's really a key point in the chapter. He then links this to the belated land reform exercises in Zimbabwe, which he says began 2 decades after independence, and were also, at the outset, believed to be the agency for primitive accumulation and patronage on the part of the existing political elite, and then also the military security top brass and the upper echelons of the civil service and parastatal sectors, including the supposedly independent judiciary, traditional leaders, and ruling party chiefs. So beginning with the first family itself, the vice presidents, cabinet ministers and their deputies, provincial governors, ministers, top brass in the army, and almost the entire leadership of the Supreme and High Courts, and all traditional leaders, all these were, for the most part, implicated in an order of hierarchy that included beneficiaries of the first 4,000 commercial farms and estates that were acquired by the state on the back of the fast-track legislation that followed one of the most violent episodes in Zimbabwe's post-independence period. So I think what he's expressing is his disappointment with the land reform initiatives as really privileging already privileged groups in Zimbabwe. And while he says this exercise was less violent than the colonial violence associated with pre-independence Zimbabwe, the fast track of land reform, which began under the politically charged circumstances of the referendum in February 2000, could have been the agency through which former white settler agrarian bourgeoisie and the indigenous one, but instead the process lacked the enormous financial and technical market resources with which colonialism was able to create such a class in a different historical context. So there was an opportunity, according to the author, to use land reform as a means of kind of bolstering or creating this new bourgeoisie in the country, but that key moment wasn't optimally utilized because the state itself lacked the resources with which to enable the further use of that land appropriation exercise for anyone else other than those who were already the beneficiaries, that comprador bourgeoisie. So in short, he says the alliance between the comprador bourgeoisie class and sections of the security forces, including the judiciary and other arms of the state over the last 2 decades, he argues represents the failure of the former national liberation movement as an agency of political and economic development. Just want to check on how I'm doing for time.
You have 4 minutes.
The next section, and you see I've still got quite a lot of the chapter to get through, and it's so interesting. So the next section of the chapter deals with the securocrat state, and what are the features of that state. And he suggests here that a securocracy is the very antithesis of a democracy, because he says these types of setups occur when rule is implemented with or despite popular will. And he says the securocrat state is one in which the military security apparatus is the dominant factor in the power complex. And in Zimbabwe, this revolves around, in symbolic and also other terms, the proverbial office of the president and his term in office as head of state, as commander-in-chief of the defense forces, and so on. And what he then goes on to explore is the gap that has developed between the president and the privileged group that surround him, and then also the rest of the country, I guess, the petite bourgeoisie and the working class. And he says, so in retrospect, the rise of the securocrat state can therefore be traced to at least 3 main features that I'd like to describe here. He says that have characterized Zimbabwean social formation over the past 36 years, and these are the very factors around which the possible trajectory of a political and economic reform, new reform, has been thawing or kind of coming into existence, even under the conditions of its own contradictions, as forces for change and development occur. And the first factor he identifies is the rise and rise of the big man and the commensurate subversion of national institutions. So he says this is one of the factors that have got to be analysed in a great deal more detail. The second factor he talks about is the primacy of national security as the main function and main preoccupation of the state. And he talks about this being kind of a guise under which various justifications for the ongoing term of office syndrome is perpetuated. The primacy of national security is justifying the need for presidents for life. And then the third factor he talks about, I just want to get to that quickly before the time ends. Many pages later in the chapter, is the decline of cabinet rule and the consequent relegation of socio-economic policy imperatives. So these are three factors that he believes to be worth exploring in terms of generating alternates and understanding how Zimbabwe might emerge from its current impasse. And I think at that point, colleagues, I'd like to end, and I think what we could do is distribute the chapter because it does make for fascinating reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Balfour, for that excellent reading of the paper. Thank you. The ideas were conveyed very brilliantly. So we will now open up the floor for questions and comments. We have 30 minutes till the tea break. So I will... Sure. Derek wants to be the first to ask a question, but okay. Please, can I have indication of hands? Okay, so I see Professor Maloka there. Thank you, Professor Maraj. Okay, so there's quite a few. Can we take 3 in the first round? So I've noted Professor Maloka there, Professor Maraj. Got Stanley here. Okay, Derek, you wanted to ask a question. Okay, so I'll take yours in the pocket. Or do you want to go first? Okay, okay, go ahead.
No, thank you very much, Chairperson, and thanks to for our colleagues, the panel, for what I think are very excellent presentation, including our colleague for a brilliant attempt to capture what is a very long and detailed presentation and expose by our friend Ibo in his absence. And we know that Ibo is a combination of his own personal experience in that document, but it's well written, and thank you very much. I just wanted to make very quick observations on the 3 presentations. The first one is that the problem of Zimbabwe we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it intellectually, but also as a country, because it's going to affect us. Already we're talking about a number of things that we're already experiencing from the Zimbabwean experience. But the possibility of a civil war in Zimbabwe is not it's not a far-fetched possibility. The experience of Zimbabwe is quite similar to a number of experiences. When you have a number of factors together, you could have a civil war as an outcome, where there is a fusion of the leader and the party, fusion of the leader and the state, the fusion of the party and the state, and the failure of the party to handle succession issues. We have a problem. That's what happened in Cote d'Ivoire. That's why when Fort Boigny left and he died unexpectedly, they could not. Then somebody came and said, no, I'm his illegitimate son, I should take over, and then the country degenerated into a civil war. One of the countries that was very stable throughout the Cold War. The same thing also in the DRC, former Congo. Mobutu was a very powerful person. Mobutu, after he killed our comrade Lumumba, the country was stable throughout the Cold War. Then he left. Then there was a serious power vacuum. And that is unfortunately what is happening in Zimbabwe, that the party is failing to handle the succession. And when there are alternatives and other tendencies around succession, some of them are being pushed aside, etc., etc., etc. We don't know what's going to happen when there's a sudden and unexpected departure of some of the actors there. And we should prepare ourselves for that. And unfortunately, we've seen even some of ourselves who have evolved. Ibo himself, he has evolved. There was a time when he saw what was happening in Zimbabwe. He's a third Chimurenga. He used to write, when this thing started, when people were raising critical questions, people used to say, no, and then I remember I was with him at some rally addressed by the current president. You know, Mzala and all those things, and now this is Mureng, and so on and so on and so on. The frustration that the comrades are undergoing there is quite, and even Joyce Mujuru, and so on and so on. So what is happening in Zimbabwe, we should look at it because it could affect us. We could have a situation where once there is a sudden and a departure of a certain person there, that there is going to be a scramble over the control of the party and the state, and the security elements are going to be involved because some of the actors there are very close to the security establishment in the country. And the country could collapse, there could be a serious civil war among the comrades themselves because MDC is no longer effective, it's being finished. So that's the first thing I wanted to say on Zimbabwe, that the civil war is something that I'm not trying to be dramatic, but I'm saying when you have a leader who's so powerful, when that leader leaves and there's no clarity and certainty on succession, there's a serious power about him that could lead to a civil war among the forces that all want to be in that position, in that powerful position, simultaneously and at the same time. Something which is physics, in terms of physics, very interesting. The second thing is that is around Comrade Chubin, a very excellent presentation. I wanted to ask him to verify something that I heard, but to say that you didn't talk about the Putin factor. I thought you would talk about the Putin factor, which some may see it as quite positive. Once you are demonizing the Western media, sometimes you may think that you are doing a good job. But you spoke about South Africa-Russia relations. I think the problem with South Africa-Russia relations after our freedom, of course, as you know, that we institutionalized South Africa-Russia relations through the ICAC, which is a bilateral mechanism that we have between South Africa and Russia. On the South African side, is led by the foreign minister. On the Russian side, is led by the Minister of Natural Resources. And the perception that you get from South Africa is that the Russians are interested in South African mines, and later now, recently, also in the nuclear build project and so on. So there's not been a lot of emphasis in the political relations and strengthening political relations between the two countries. But what has happened recently with post-Ukraine, you now see that Russia is beginning to also to see South Africa in political terms because of the strong stance we've taken, especially in the G20, when some people wanted Russia suspended. The last point, very quickly, and Comrade Begis. No, I wanted to ask Comrade Shubin a small question. I was told what made Putin is that Yeltsin was traveling with some American advisors. I was told a story. And then he was, he had some strong points around alcohol. So he was asleep. And these advisors were talking and laughing and making jokes about him. And then he recovered his consciousness and they could not see that he was actually awake. And he listened to them, they were joking and they were saying, oh, we never thought this would be so easy. Look at how we controlled him and all those kind of things. So when he got home, apparently, he then called his advisors and he said, go and find me a very strong person. This is what I hear, this is what the Americans are trying to do here. And that's how I'm told that it's him who identified Putin to take over from me and gave him a clear nationalist mandate. So, but I don't know how true is that, but it's something that I've heard. But then the last thing on Comrade Beg, I think you spoke at length and you spoke very well. I just wanted to find out from you whether Europe is a benchmark for human development. When you started your expose on democracy, you started with Herodotus. Is this really the history of how democracy developed or evolved around the world, or this is the European account of how democracy developed around the world? Because Europe has created a certain discourse and narrative about human civilization, which places itself at the center. If you go to the movies now, there's a movie on Egypt. You see the Egyptians were pure Africans like us with big noses, but you've got white people that play the role of Egyptians. And it's accepted. When they play an Egyptian, they always play white people. But that's how Europe has defined, and unfortunately it's disseminated through the educational system. That history starts in Europe. You start anything, you open a book, they start with Greece. Herodotus, they start with Aristotle, they start with Plato, and so on. So I'm just asking whether can we use Europe as a benchmark? Because before Europe there was a state, but different forms of the state and democratic practice, and so on and so on. But I think I'll stop there because I've spoken a lot. But I thought on the issue of the export of democracy, we could have spoken about the color revolution, which is something I tried to touch when we were discussing it.
Okay, can we take the Mirage there and then we'll come back to you?
Can I just ask our questions to be short and precise? Thank you.
Thanks very much, and also for the guidance. I'm going to raise three very quick, so all of the other parts about thanking the presenter, a very important session. I constantly learn when colleagues from international relations and the subject called politics present. I think I'm very unfamiliar with the literature itself because my assumptions get questioned. Because of that, I hope I'm also learning through this process. So the one point I pick up, and I really think it's useful if we emphasize it from the last presentation, the paper itself, is the question of myths of transformation. In other words, how are these stories being created that suggest something, but in practice reflect something else? Now, why I raise that is because if we want to be critical about where we are, we need to know where we are. And for that, it needs work, it needs research. And this is something that I think we need to take much more seriously, and it ties then very strongly into the second presentation from Comrade Schuben. And us analyzing in South Africa the notion of intra-class conflict at the level of society before we come to interclass war is very important. There's a lot more for us to learn there, and it ties both to the national question, but also our tasks in the current phase. And the current phase is not defined by us purely domestically. It is an international geopolitical transition that's taking place. And I constantly argue that our focus should be on the changes in the production structure and the consequences for all of us. Within this, I want to maybe then relate it to Becky's also very illuminating presentation. I mean, I tie in with what Eddie's saying about the origins of the concept democracy. And I really think we need to appreciate our wider evolutionary development. And in this, I would encourage Becky, if the paper gets developed further, you ended with who has the power. And I want to encourage maybe some reflection on what is the power. Because that's something, if we look back then at what Schuben was raising and Comrade Ivo is raising, is also critical to us. I'm completely convinced that the format by which we organize ourselves may have something to do with our subjugation. We are trapping ourselves into institutions who may be anachronistic to our requirements. Thank you.
Can we take these two hands here, Sandy, and then we'll ask the presenters to respond. Thank you. And Derek, you can ask the first question in the next round.
This question is to Dr. Becky. My name is Stanley Ehiane from UKZN. I think I'll start my question from the last question you asked towards the end of the presentation, where you did talk about, you asked a question, you said, is democracy a panacea to global challenge? And my question goes this way, is democracy a panacea to African challenge? Now, consider the wave of democracy and democratization that created African political conflict. Could you be that Africa does not understand the concept of democracy, or probably Africa have not been able to evolve their own democracy? If yes, then we should expect democratic exportation. Please, can you respond to those two questions? Thanks.
Thank you. Can you please pass the mic to the back? Yes, the gentleman in the red. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Murume from UKZN. I say thank you for the presenters, but my question is going to Dr. Becky. My question is this: according to the presentation of Dr. Becky, he was talking about the imposition and the arrogance of USA, America, to the world. But I have, my question is, what do you say about South Africa in the continent? Because now, for example, in DRC, we are going to have election in November. But we know, we are aware that Joseph Kabila, after 15 years, that he was in power, he still have the hand of South African government. And most of the people in the DRC, they don't want Joseph Kabila to run for the third term. So what do you say about that imposition and that arrogance? Thank you.
Nick, I'm happy to ask you two questions. Okay.
Thank you very much. These are very interesting questions indeed. I'll try to be brief so that in the interest of time so we can have an engagement. Let me start off with the last one. It's a very interesting one. During the time I spent in Kenya, I heard a lot about what people called South Africa. They called it what? South Africa is making itself Africa's America. There's the concept I had. So basically the accusation being that South Africa is imposing itself on the continent. I found myself having lengthy discussions on this point. I said, okay, let's take it as a fact that you guys know what you're talking about. But then let's look at South Africa's involvement on the continent. On the one hand, the continent needs South Africa. On the other hand, the continent does not need South Africa. That is a fact. We have problems in Sudan, we're there. We have problems in DRC, we're there. Zimbabwe, we're there, whether we're calling it a quiet diplomacy or what, but we are there. You look at Mali, throughout the continent, South Africa gets involved in terms of trying to solve political conflict. So now, which point do you emphasize? Is it the helping part or is it the domination part? Because people are looking at the DRC and South Africa's relations with Joseph Kabila, they are saying that whenever South Africa gets involved in the DRC, it's because of self-interest. When Cyril Ramaphosa is appointed by SADC to address situations in Lesotho, they say, first of all, it's his own personal business interest. And then the other one is marketing South Africa. So basically, this one is a very dicey issue. The foreign policy of South Africa is such that we don't tell countries what to do, but we share our own experiences with them and let countries decide what they want to do. If the people in DRC think that South Africa can help them, so be it. If they say we no longer need you guys, we can step back. That is fine. It's the CAR, there have been problems there. So basically the point I'm making is there is a perception that South Africa is doing what America is doing to the globe. That is a perception, but that is a point we need to interrogate. Okay, I'll leave it there for now. Stanley is asking a question, is democracy a panacea for Africa's problem? No, I said that my own observation is that democracy is not a solution to all the world's problems. That includes Africa. Remember that, and I'll try to link up with the points that Prof. Maloka and Prof. Maharaj also asked about the origin. I deliberately said Herodotus used this term in the 5th BC or 5 BC. I deliberately did that because before then, it doesn't necessarily mean that there was nothing democratic, however democracy is defined. And that's how I tie it up with the issue of power. When I teach in international relations, when I teach democracy and when I teach globalization, I look at what people have said and then I look at things from the African perspective. For example, with globalization, there are people who tell you that globalization is a 19th century event. And others will come and say, no, no, no. In fact, in the 14th century, we have the Mongol Empire stretching all the way from China to Western Europe. And then they'll dispute the fact that globalization is a 19th century event. And then I come and say, if you look at trans-Saharan trade in Africa, it predates all of those. And I make the same point when I look at the development of education and higher education in particular, including the book I wrote in 2012. Those are the points I was making. So basically, the point I'm making here is, yes, of course, Africa fits in the broader scheme of things, but we cannot say we take a cue from Europe, which is the point that Prof. Maloka was asking. I'm not in any way saying that democracy can only be traced in Greece. I'm saying this is the grand narrative. And then when it comes to it being written down, then Herodotus is cited. By the way, people from the southern part of Greece, they spent time in Egypt. Most of what you find in Greece and is called Greek civilization is in fact Egyptian civilization. And geographically, you know, Egypt is in Africa. So basically, most of what Europeans claim to be their inventions are in fact African inventions which were brought back in a different form, and then Europeans claimed it. Thank you.
I'll try to answer point by point, but just one point back to all these, you see. Yes, it was a democracy, but we should not forget about slaves. Because at that democratic gathering, slaves were not there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And women.
Yeah, and women too. Women were not there until the 20th century in many countries. So Russia was one of the very first countries to introduce the right to vote for women. You see. Yeah. Now, point by point, you see, what Comrade Eddie was asking. Putin's factor, you see, I'm against the cult of personality, maybe because my youth coincided with 1956, when they criticized, between us, over-criticized Stalin. Stalin we can discuss separately, I don't want now. Everybody's interested, I will tell you more. But, of course, Putin is popular. Putin will get again majority if he stands in 1918. He has general support, including the left wing, on the issues of international relations, defense, but we cannot, sorry, now speaking myself and my friends, we cannot agree with his reluctance to dismiss those people who are responsible for economic failures. Because as far as the economic sector is concerned, it's the same neoliberal IMF and this and that, you see. And this discrepancy one day should be solved one way or another. That's in short, you see. Second point about South African-Russian relations. Yes, my feeling, I would agree that maybe the choice of national, what you call it, the Minister of Natural Resources vis-a-vis Minister of International Cooperation and Development, not the best, though present minister just inherited from the previous who was much stronger. But we should not reduce it just to intergovernment contacts. Intergovernment contacts may be not as good, I mean not as wide as we want them to be, but they're there. But we almost have nothing else. Our trade was up to $1 billion, which is nothing. I mean, comparing with the real possibilities. And I understood that last year it even decreased. I haven't changed that. I haven't seen the figures, you see. Cultural exchange minimum, education exchange minimum. All these NGOs, very weak exchange. A bit because of BRICS, there were some South African coming. But that worries me even more than intergovernmental. We'll try to do something. As I say in that project which I'm supposed to guide, we just want to go point by point on the declaration signed in 1913. There are about a dozen of points there, and to see what is the situation and what can be done. Now that story is about Putin, there are many stories, you see, Americans, sorry, about Yeltsin. He could be drunk, but I don't think he would be sleeping, and American advisors would be there, and his security would not be there, you see. It's a bit of fantastic. But one point is more serious. By the end of his rule, he himself apparently began to understand the failure of foreign policy, where especially when they started bombing Yugoslavia. You remember that NATO aggression against Yugoslavia? When Primakov, who was prime minister, was flying, and he was a good man, he asked pilots to turn back, because it was very arrogant to start bombing when prime minister was going to come there to vice president for this bilateral meeting in Washington. You see? But sometimes, of course, he was irrational. I mean, Yeltsin, I remember on TV, it never been, I think, repeated or broadcasted again. He was in Beijing, and he said, the American president, he said that he is ruling the world, he is the, I'm speaking from memory. No, it's us, me and the Chinese chairman. We will lead it. So in the end of it, you see, he was also not pro-Western, and he used to be early. You see. They chose, he was looking, and you know it was a revolving chair, there were 3 prime ministers, changed in 6 months or something, but finally it was Putin, and it was not the worst change, definitely not the worst choice. And by the way, speaking of economics, nobody remember that Putin has PhD in economics, but that's another story, quite another story. Yeah, yes, I think these are 2 main points what Eddie asked. And since we discuss here this institution authority, I want to add 1 point, you see. I am not criticizing your legal system. I studied a bit of law in my younger years. But I do criticize the International Criminal Court. I believe it's a criminal organization, just like the so-called called on Yugoslavia. Šešelj, this prominent Serbian leader, is radical, too much radical. He was leader of radical party, nationalist. But they kept him before trial for 11 months. Sorry, 11 years in The Hague. They just switched him off the political life of the country. And this is now not the only case. Several people, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. It's assignment, you see, just keep them there. Then finally they have to release him, acquit him after 11 years out of political life. You see. There is a very good professor of ours, Alexander Mzala, who defended his 2nd degree exactly, doctorate second, 2 steps of that, exactly on the right of defense and these international tribunals, when he shows all deficiency of that system. Okay, and now there was something else. I have 1 question, you see. Sorry to Ivo, but Ivo is not there. The title of the paper was The Rise and Fall of the Securocrat State, but I have not heard about the fall of the Securocrat. And if to call the present state of Zimbabwe Securocrat, I'm not sure it fell. So that's just a point of information. Yeah. Any other question was, please remind me. Maybe I missed something. No? You want big? Yeah, 1 comment maybe. Look, when you spoke about whether Africa needs South Africa, look, when you are big, you will be always accused and hegemony. That's the same as Russians. It's just unavoidable. You have to be tolerated. Somebody will always think that you want to dictate, even if you don't want to dictate. But what is more serious, maybe, I remember that was a long time ago, it was the conference with Dr. Maloka organized that one was in Africa Institute. And somebody from Tanzania was saying that before we had freedom fighters from South Africa in our country, now 90-some% of them are male white Afrikaners coming for business. That element is there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we can take a very quick 2nd round, but I think that Derek wanted to ask the first question as one stepped out. Are there any other questions? Prof. Belfer, would you like to comment on the... Okay. So, is there a question there? Okay. Yes, Minister. And Derek. Derek, please ask your question. We're waiting for you. And then I'll... thank you.
It's to Becky. I came in a bit late on your paper, and I think you might have posed the question if America are they still managing the world in what you described. I would want to say that they do, and perhaps to suggest that, and I want your thoughts on this, that they manage by multinationals and what I think of as liquid capital, and through mechanisms like education and development policies via World Bank, IMF, United Nations, and what Spivak refers to as the notion of the rule of law. I'd like to know your thoughts on those things.
Thank you. May we take that question there, and then...
Thank you very much. I guess I wanted to pick up on the issue that Professor Shubin raised. And is cohesion possible in class society. You didn't delve into it, but it's a question that you touched on. And I think the thrust of the discussions, presumably because this is a left-wing gathering, has focused on the bourgeoisie and their role in perpetuating the system. And if one perhaps can borrow from Mzala himself, I would say that because of that, we cooking the working class, but what we have in the pot is the bourgeoisie. So I will, the stumbling block to social cohesion has rightly been identified as economic inequality, amongst other factors. And of course, we could also include a spatial division of land dispossession, if you like. But in our country, when we talk economic inequality, we don't call it by name. We refer to poverty, we refer to unemployment, and then we just call inequality without exactly defining it, right? And of course, this is problematic because we focus on the effects rather than the cause, and the cause is economic inequality. So when you think about cohesion, we're talking about the glue, and of course this is marked by participation, by involvement in decision making, where you have a sense of belonging and ownership in what is happening in your country. But what I want to draw our attention to is the fact that, you know, like life in this country is what happens whilst we are busy debating and critiquing these things, and the focus is always on the bourgeoisie and not the working class themselves, because we also have to ask ourselves, what is the attitude and conduct and values of the working class in this country? And I find that to be that they share the values of the bourgeoisie themselves. And that is very problematic, because the working class is a very significant segment of our society, and they are very powerful, and not many things can happen in this society without their willing participation. I mean, like homes plunge into a crisis if a helper or a maid doesn't turn up. But what does it mean exactly? And because I believe that, I think the poor, the working class, have to accept that everything that happens to them is a result of what they do or don't do, right? And perpetuating this victim syndrome around them is quite problematic. And I spend a lot of time when I'm with them at garages, at places like this, and at supermarkets, just to engage and find out what their attitude is to their own plight. And I think I've made the point that they subscribe to the same values. So is social cohesion possible in a class society? I think the answer is, however lacking and superficial is that yes, it is, because the working class is the glue that holds this society together, and we're not focusing on their attitude, their values, and their conduct. We're busy talking about the bourgeoisie that is benefiting from the system.
Thank you for that. Derek, sorry, here, the Minister had a question, and then we'll come there.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant. No, I'm not asking any questions. I'm just making some comments and suggestions. I really agree. Let me join those who say this has been a very, very interesting session. And thanks for the three presentations. Just a few points which it would be interesting maybe as part of, you know, Baby's points that he's posing about democracy. It may be interesting going forward for the center to try also and identify what is Mzala's conception of democracy as a matter of interest. In his writings, you know, his theory of the state, for example, as you
you posed. It's just by way of a suggestion. I agree with Shubin. I've always had problems with this concept, phrase of imagine this, imagine that. As if those things were not there before. Now, and of course, the very interesting question that Usanti is trying to answer on is social cohesion possible in a class society? I must say I'm troubled by what Shubin is saying in terms of that in the early 90s there were 4 places that were doing Russian studies, and 22 years later there's none. I think it's a big challenge really for the country. Just very quickly, the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences is hosting the South African component of the BRICS think tank. Now, there are quite a few people here who are part of that. I think maybe that's a challenge, that maybe that's one platform. The Mzala Center itself might want at some stage to participate. But it's one platform I would actually urge that we really consider that, to really begin to engage with the Russian studies. May it even be possible to approach a university and see if there would be a university that's interested in this. It is really a problem. Now, my friend Ibo is not here. It's a very nice paper that he has written. He sent it to me as well electronically. I'm looking forward. I have not read it, but thanks for the wonderful presentation. Comrade Shubin makes a point. He repeats it. He made it, quickly. It's troubling actually because it's an important question. I know the SACP has been trying to deal with this. If, as the churches or the religious groups, for instance, and many others are calling for the resignation of the president, what will that solve? I'm not arguing for or against in this instance. I'm just, what is it that we are trying to deal with? Would removal of an individual actually deal with it? I think it's a crucial question, although Eddie raises an important point at the same time, that yes, maybe the departure of an individual can in some instances have huge consequences because of how that society, like Zimbabwe, has evolved. I'm not denouncing that. Rather, I think it may be important to ask the question, what is it that we are trying to deal with in South Africa today? What is the principal problem that is actually facing us? Just the last 2 quick points, Chair, I'm sorry. I'm usually very conscious about time. Oh yeah, by the way, just a bit of an advert. The professor that Shubin is talking about, the Russian professor, I met with him. In fact, the latest edition of the African Communist has got his interesting piece on the International Criminal Court, which I would urge comrades to read. Just the last, Ibo has a very interesting concept which troubles me, a phrase. He says the post-colonial state, I'm sure he must be repeating it there. His definition of a post-colonial state is very interesting. He says, the post-colonial state is a bourgeois state without a bourgeoisie. It's a very interesting, in essence, what Ibo is arguing for is something that the problem with post-colonial states, they never developed a national bourgeoisie. So the solution to progressive development of post-colonial societies in Africa is the development and strengthening of a national bourgeoisie. Now that's interesting because that's in contrast, for instance, to the ANC and the Alliance conception, which is the working class as the main motive force for development. Ibo is saying it's the national bourgeoisie that will be the principal motive force for the development of African society. But it's not yet. I can't continue with that debate with him. We're always debating that. You know, but it's a very interesting paper. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I'll take just that last one. And then, are there more? Okay, all right, we'll take two.
Good morning, my name is Tracy Gonyama. I'm a contract researcher at Mzala Center. I'm also a historian. And this question is for Peggy. I just want to bring in the historical perspective to his presentation. The question is for Peggy. I mean, what is normally called using the past to understand the present. And Mzala did that a lot in his writing, especially in the book on culturalism. And I think this historical perspective is often missing in our analysis and understanding of some of the things that are happening today. And when you suggest alternatives, then that's where we miss the point, because this historical perspective is now. In your using of the phrase democracy, I've heard other arguments that it's not only a Western concept. How would you apply it to pre-colonial, pre-capitalist system of Ukonza, where somebody subjects himself to a king or chief in return for land and other, the socio-economic, parts of that system of Ukonza, the political party, or is only a phase analytically in understanding modern or bourgeois democracy? Or maybe we should come up with a completely different phrase to understand and explain these pre-capitalist societies.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be very quick. Starting with Percy, I think you and I are moving from the same premise. It so happens that I'm both a political scientist and a historian. Yeah, so I move in the two worlds quite easily. Yeah, indeed, you are absolutely right. And that's why I even brought in the issue of Tingundla in Swaziland. I've studied Tingundla, I've written about Tingundla, and I've debated the issue. I've interviewed people who are doing the Constitutional Review Commission in Swaziland. So I think I have a rough idea of how Tingundla operates. And then looking at the general definitions of a democracy, my argument was, before I went to Swaziland, I thought that no, this Tingundla thing must just be taken out of the equation. But then after studying it, I'm of the view that in fact there are good things that happen in that kind of system, some of which in fact supersede what happens in the so-called liberal democratic world. So the point I'm making then is, in the pre-colonial societies, you have tenets. That's why I talk about tenets of democracy, characteristic features of present-day democracy. I'm saying these are pre-existing in pre-colonial societies, including Africans, of course. For example, if you look at people like Vincent Kapoya and a couple others, they argue that in the pre-colonial African societies, most of the problems we are having today never happened. If something came up, there were ways of resolving them by satisfying everyone concerned. But under the liberal democratic dispensation, you find that you are confined in a certain space and you must have certain qualities for you to operate in that space. So they are arguing that in fact, our liberal democracy as we use it today is in fact a worse system compared to what pre-colonial African societies did. Like the one we are citing, for example, Ugukonza. There was a way of including the larger public than is currently the case. Then of course we can debate about other technicalities, but I agree entirely with you. Derek, we are saying that the view expressed by Woolley and Perigo, for instance, that America seems to have deviated from its original position of managing. Then we are saying that Americans are still managing. I would say to an extent we are right, but then America has become, of late, has become hysterical. And they are frantic, they are taking decisions that would not ordinarily be taken. That is as a result of the pressure they are hearing from behind. And I cited the example of China, that China is making America uncomfortable because China is making inroads in a number of continents. And basically occupying a space which America has been claiming, saying that they are dominating everywhere, culturally, economically, politically, and so on. I usually tell people that the only time you fight is when your reasoning ability has reached a ceiling. If I make you angry, you didn't slap me at first go. You first tell me, no, I don't like what you are doing. I persist. You say, no, I don't like what you are doing. I persist, then you run out of OPs, then you beat me up. So the point I'm making is, one of the reasons why America keeps attacking all the countries I cited is not because they want to, but because they have to under the realist theoretical framework. Because they are basically saying, we are now uncomfortable. There are enemies that are about to take what we have, whatever it is. So then in order for us to protect that, then we have to strike before they do. So that is the premise for Nxumalo.
All right, thank you so much. I think, can we please have a round of applause? Also to you for your questions. I think that the session really raised some invigorating debate and discussion, and especially the question of what will we solve by removing an individual. But I think, to conclude, if I can say, how do we as South Africans understand democracy? What does it mean to us? And perhaps that is the question that we need to engage with. And in the coming days, what will happen will actually tell us what we as South Africans believe our democracy is. So thank you once again. I'll hand over to you to make announcements. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's 11:15, so we're going to reduce tea time to 15 minutes, and then we could all come back in order to start at 12 o'clock again. No? 11:30, sorry. Okay, we're going to start the second session. I'm going to hand over to the chair, Professor Moletsani, to introduce the next two papers. And thank you.
Hello, I'm Lebo Moletsani from the School of Education at UKZN, and I'm a friend of Mzala. Yes, I've said it. And so the next two papers, I'll introduce the two speakers at the same time so as to save time. And each one of them will present for about 25, maybe 30 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And that means we will have 30 minutes left for discussion. I'm hoping for more, but we'll see what happens. So the first speaker is Dr. Greg Houston from the Human Sciences Research Council. He's the Chief Research Specialist and a research fellow of the History Department at the University of the Free State. Yes. So just the highlights of his work. He's authored the National Liberation Struggle in South Africa, a case study of the UDF, 1983 to 1987. He is also known for his co-edited book, Public Participation in Democratic Governance in South Africa. And my favorite is his contribution to the Voices of Liberation series published by the HSRC Press. The second speaker is Professor Robert Balfour, my friend and colleague. He's the Dean of Education at Northwest University. And his area of specialization is literary and applied language studies. His two books are Culture, Capital and Representation, and the most recent one being Education in a New South African Crisis and Change. And what I like most about him is that he's a budding artist. He had his first solo exhibition in 2015 in Durban. Okay, I'll hand over to the speakers.
Thank you, Prof. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Look, it's not working. Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm office bound. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, not least of all because it gets me away from my in-laws. And a good reason to put off my phone for 2 days. It's an opportunity really to renew friendships that I've not seen for a long time, and also to make new friendships. And I go away with a lot of new ideas and things that one needs to do. I've chosen a rather difficult topic, the first and second transitions and the national question. And I have to apologize to Professor Nxumalo first, because I deal with race, and not class.
Apologize to the
It's not accepted. I begin with a quotation from an interview conducted with the late Chris Hani a few days before he died. That was conducted with Guri Kalinikos. And Chris stated that in 1993, that we have a new struggle. And that is a struggle to make freedom and democracy worthwhile to ordinary South Africans. And that is the struggle for housing, service delivery, basically. I use the theoretical basis of Mzala's theorization of a national question in South Africa to deal as an overview of the paper. The basic focus of the paper is an analysis of perceptions of and the impact of the ANC's first transition on the resolution of the national question. I argue that part of the challenge is the persistence of various nationalisms, as well as the unintended consequences of the transformative agenda, which inhibits the resolution of the national question. I then conclude with a review of the notion, the ANC's notion of a second transition, or phase of transition, in the context of the ongoing challenges faced in the resolution of the national question. My theoretical framework is based on the chapter written by Mzala in Van Diepen, or edited by Van Diepen, in which he traces the historical treatment of the theoretical issue of the national question, beginning with Marx and Engels, going through the white Labour Party, the Communist Party of South Africa, the South African Communist Party, and a little treatment of the ANC. I'm just dealing with this as a brief overview, not in great detail. The central issues, the central ideas that Mzala puts forward is that capitalist development in South Africa gave rise to unity among African workers. And he argued that nationalism of the oppressed is a reflection of the black people's concrete material conditions in the circumstances under which they found themselves, as well as the relationship to political power. On the other hand, the white settler population systematically conquered the territory and subjected the indigenous population. The consequence of this was the division of South Africa into oppressor and oppressed nations. Mzala argued that the resolution of the national question is through the liberation of the oppressed. And this resolution proceeds from, firstly, the integration of the two nations, and secondly, under conditions of total equality into a single nation. Now, these are the two core issues that one is dealing with here. The issue of integration of nations under conditions of equality. And I want you to just keep this in mind, because I'm then going to focus on the contradiction between the two later on. Mzala argued that at the point of liberation, the various nations will gravitate irresistibly towards integration. In other words, he saw this as a process that would evolve. Once the liberation has been achieved, the two nations, being the oppressor nation and the oppressed nations, would come together. So integration is central. And a lot of the sort of criticisms of Mzala's thesis or theory arise from the failure to achieve integration. But it is very important to remember that for Mzala, it is premised on the transition from capitalism to socialism. And I think it answers Shubin's question. In a class society, Mzala is saying we cannot achieve, we cannot resolve the national question in a class society. Mzala saw the nationalism of the oppressed as a key obstacle to the resolution of the national question. And from 1948, the central nationalism of the oppressor is Afrikaner nationalism. And Afrikaner nationalism is based on qualification of membership to the nation on specific characteristics such as race, culture, language, and a whole central core ideas that were centered around Afrikaner nationalism, the idea of the folk, the whole history of the Great Trek and so on, that created this nation that did not really exist before. But in a sense, Afrikaner nationalism has consequences for all of us. On the other hand, African nationalism is based on territory and not on race. And this is captured in the phrase in the Freedom Charter, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. In my paper, I have a long story about the history of the struggle. And I conclude with the analysis of the 1980s, where the struggle reached unprecedented levels. But most importantly, it became a truly non-racial struggle. It drew in thousands and thousands of people of all races. And it was an extremely liberating experience for people who were involved in the struggle. To begin to see people as people, and not as Indian, white, or colored, and so on. So the struggle itself created the basis, and my argument is that Mzala was writing at a period in which the vision was there, the potential for the resolution of the national question was there. However, after the unbanning of the ANC, it became very clear that the ANC was failing to draw support from colored Indian and white communities. And in large part, the issues around negotiations, where the National Party shifted the focus to group rights, to the issues of minorities. And people begin to identify that they are minority in a potentially majority-ruled African country. It led to a resurgence of racial identities. And a very important resource that people need to look at in terms of the debates that were occurring at the time in 1991, 92, 93, are the O'Malley interviews on the Nelson Mandela website. And what I do is I just pick a few of the interviews from there in which people are saying these are the challenges that Indian people face, why they would not join the ANC, why colored people would not join the ANC, why white people would not join the ANC. But I want to go back a bit and to try to look at some of the things that the minister said yesterday. We need to look at the harsh realities. And to go back to what Becky said yesterday as well, the issue of apartheid racial stratification. The racial division of labor, in which there was this hierarchy of who was at the top and who was at the bottom. In some respects, many of our people still operate in the racial hierarchy. The hierarchy of privilege, white at the top and down. But very much linked to this is perceptions of superiority, and this is enduring. as a so-called colored person, people think you think the same as them because you belong to their race. So you get colored people who come to you in conversation, and the types of things that people say. This racism is deep, and it persists, and it is perpetuated in the family and in various other modes. And I'm sure the students that are here experience this almost daily, and many of us do experience in our work situations and elsewhere. The perception then of an ANC, an African-led government, becomes very much problematic for a lot of people. Now, this is not something that we can ignore. It's a harsh reality. I'm living in Cape Town at the moment. I'm actually from Wentworth. I tried for 2 years to convince people to vote ANC, but I gave up. I'm in Cape Town. I don't even see anybody trying to convince a constituency, and I think this is the challenge, because there's a constituency there, the back. What do they call this? People live in the back of the houses. It is a huge, my own in-laws, there's 23 of them living on one property. And I can't even go there because there's nowhere to sit. This is horrible. But this is why I say that such a topic is so interesting. It's important. Because we are tending to ignore the potential to go beyond the racial barriers that exist, to deal with the class issues, to see what is common among us. It was there during the struggle. We had a common enemy. The common enemy still exists, of poverty. There was a concern that ANC programs were not accommodative of interests of minority groups. And there's a perception that some had of how people would behave in the 1980s at a funeral and how they would behave in a funeral in the 1990s. There was resistance to the ANC flag being placed on the coffin of a person. So the unity of action and struggle of the 1980s and preceding decades is replaced by concern about group interests. The next section of the paper is something that I'm using a methodology that I'm not very familiar with. But it's a very important flagship project of the HSRC. And that is the South African Social Attitude Survey, which we conduct yearly since 2003. It is a survey of a representative sample of South Africans. A lot of biographical detail, meaning that you could use the data in terms of looking at race, gender, class, age, and so on. The starting point in terms of identifying national identity is to assess the degree of national unity in South Africa. The question, or rather the statement that respondents were asked to look at, is to answer the question, neither agree or disagree to the statement, I would rather be a citizen of South Africa than of any other country in the world. What you can see is among cultures, the levels of national pride are quite high. It is above close to 90% among South Africans. We are proud of our country. We are proud to be South African. It is very high among coloreds, Indians, and Africans. Above 90% for coloreds and Indians. Coloreds and Africans. Just about 87% for Indians, and just over 72% for whites. But what is alarming is that there's almost 20% of whites would rather live elsewhere. Self-identification is an indicator of progress towards development of national unity. The way we identify ourselves in relation to the nation and other criteria. Sorry. I used data from another survey which was conducted as a longitudinal survey between 2004 and 2012. We can see here that many South Africans identify themselves as South African. In 2004, it was 52.8. 2012, almost similar. So there's a strong sense of being South African. Unfortunately, I could not use the HSRC survey here. They added a question, or rather a classification of identity about family relationship. Most South Africans would rather be identified as a father, mother, husband, or wife than anything else. So it distorts the sort of the answer. Race is not a very strong feature here. But when you take that element in the census data, when you take out the father, the family relationship, race becomes very significant because the dynamics are about religion, where Indian people identify strongly with religion, which relates to ethnicity. So this, but it was difficult to use that data. National unity in a highly diversified country lies on trust between the different groups. The category here is, do you agree, neither agree, or disagree to the statement, people of different racial groups do not trust or like each other. I want you to keep these questions in your mind because, in a sense, how would you respond to these things is very important. We can see here that there are high levels of belief among all race groups that we do not like each other or do not trust each other. It is close to 70% for almost all, and with whites it's just above 70%. We do not like each other. And what does this mean for national identity? It's dismal. The prospects of national identity are dismal. In the first transition, I see a contradiction between Mzala's two conditions for the resolution of the national question under the circumstances prevailing: integration and equality, bringing the nations together and achieving equality. In the first transition, there are two key elements: democratic state and democratizing state and society, and meeting basic needs. Democratization of state and society involved the first elections, the democratic parliament, the government of national unity, the creation of new administrations led by the ANC subsequently. It also involved the transformation of state machinery, the civil service, the judiciary, the army, the police, and so on. The main feature of that transformation was the replacement of white males in civil service, in the judiciary, a process that is still going on and has varying levels of success. Over the past 22 years, we've seen extensive criticism of government failure. The media has, there's stacks and stacks of pages in which the media criticizes the failures of government. But we need to acknowledge that there are also challenges within government. Poor administration, corruption, maladministration. Now, to go back to racial perceptions and the way we look at each other, issues of trust is so bad. But there's also this perception of superiority that me as belonging to this group, I'm more capable than you belonging to that group. And I sit with people, in this, it's disturbing to see people blame failures on race without looking at any other thing, that actually corruption is not a South African phenomenon. It is not an African phenomenon in South Africa itself. But you cannot explain this to people who simply see things in terms of race. Now, the transformation of state machinery has impacted differently on the different race groups. And I want to say that this is reflected in surveys by levels of trust in the national government. We can see the racial difference. Africans have high levels of trust in the national government. Not that high, just over 50%, which reflects other concerns. Colours and Indians just over 30%. But the high level of distrust of the government among whites is disturbing. The first transition included economic transformation. which involved addressing the racial inequalities characteristic of apartheid. The two are, of course, employment equity and broad-based economic empowerment. There's a lot of criticism of this coming from all sectors, that it actually reinforces racial identities because we have to identify ourselves in terms of race. It has also led to the elite benefiting rather than the majority of South Africans. There are many unintended consequences of racial redress policies. But looking at support for affirmative action, the data indicates that African people are really supported at a high level of support. It is very poorly supported by colored and Indian people, relatively. And yet colored and Indian people are supposed to be the beneficiaries of these policies. Now, this is a belief among colored people that they will not get a job. They do not get jobs because of affirmative action. It is an incorrect assumption. Many people state that. Especially when you look at government employment. I think at provincial level, 70% of employees are actually colored at the provincial level in some instances. The second key element of the first transition, meeting basic needs. And here I use perceptions of improvements in the lives of people as useful indicators of the impact of this aspect of the first transition on the different race groups. The question asked here, in the last 5 years, has life improved, stayed the same, or gotten worse for people like you? Among African people, in 2012, you as an African person, you had a 45% chance of having improved. 45% of Africans felt their lives had improved. Among colors, it's about 30, and Indians about 37%. Rather interestingly, there's also the same levels of people who felt that their lives had not improved among colored and Indians. Whites, on the other hand, it's just about 26% who feel that their lives have improved, and over 50% who feel that their lives have not improved. But rather importantly, a lot of African people feel that their lives have stayed the same. Over a third of African people feel that there's been no improvement in their lives in 5 years. The data indicates significant differences in perceptions of the impact of the first transition on the race groups. And I want to emphasize that these are perceptions, because the reality can differ substantially from perception. But perceptions also reinforce reality. For instance, if you believe that you're not going to get a job, you are not actually going to go there and make an effort to apply for it. So it reinforces that process. And it is actually extremely difficult to explain to people. It is a nightmare to be a colored in the community there, to try to get them to think right. Because they're so immersed. And I'm generalizing. I'm making a big mistake. Because there are lots of people who think differently. It has been positive for the majority of Africans, but negative for colors, Indians, and whites in particular. There are strong perceptions of marginalization among colors and Indians. And Muhammad Adhikari has a book titled, Not White Enough, Not Black Enough, which tends to illustrate the perceptions of particularly Cape colors about the experiences in a democratic transition. But my argument is that no detailed study has been made of the actual impact on minorities. For instance, NSFAS provides funding to all race groups. It is easy to look at that and see has this been fairly distributed in terms of race. There are various other housing delivery to the various race groups. There are people who are the most anti-ANC, who do not even know that the houses that they're living in was actually given to them, the council houses that was actually then transferred to them. They're the most anti-ANC. The poorest of the poor are the strongest ANC supporters in where I come from, in Wentu, among Indians and the colored communities. I went in a cavalcade on elections, last elections, ANC cavalcade. You cannot imagine the racist comments the racist comment, and we are colored people, I've been a colored people. But every poor area that we went to, in Meerbank, and we went to, they came out. And of course they started hooting and people were screaming. But it's just a reflection of the class issue and the dimensions within class, within the colored working class. For many, their daily experience is working with someone that used to be called a boy, now an assistant. And they do not have much relationship with Africans like we do, you know, of superior intellect to me. So they don't understand what it is to look beyond this artificial barrier or this social constant. The loss of a privileged position among whites is something that is a challenge. Recently, I just had a conversation with an intern of ours, and I said to her, you know, we need to start thinking, what is actually happening? What has actually happened and is happening? So people have been pushed out of positions. The HSRC was a white institution. What has happened to all those people? What are they thinking? Then she said, phew, I've got so many things to worry about, you give me another thing to worry about. People are increasingly thinking in racial terms. And for many people, the transformation agenda promotes racist identity and benefits elites. Now the second transition, the idea of the notion of the second tradition, it fits very closely to what Mzala said. The correction of economic injustice lies at the very core of a solving of the national question. You cannot have integration without equality. It cannot occur except in a class society. So how do we deal with this? Now I'm going to speak because I've got a few minutes left. I used the discussion document that was the ANC distributed before the 2012 conference. The task of overcoming poverty, unemployment, and inequality are seen as a link between the resolution of the national question and transformation during the second transition. The focus is on poverty, income inequalities, unemployment, and transformation in ownership and control of the economy. There is a recognition that whites feel threatened by transformation. There is a recognition of the need to engage with white capital. There is a need for widespread consultation on solutions to the problems of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, in order to avoid in order to avoid a transformative agenda being determined by the elites. I do not have answers to the solution to the national question. Instead, I leave the Mzala Institute Center with a number of key questions. Does the resolution of the national question lie in de-racializing transformation policies? This has been suggested by a number of people. For instance, would phrasing affirmative action and other transformation programs as anti-poverty measures lead to resolution of the national question? What form can the socio-economic transformative agenda take so all that can be? We don't want a situation where people feel that they're not benefiting, because it creates the challenges where the Western Cape continues to become and remain Europe in Africa. And how do we achieve unity of purpose in this regard? I want to give you with just a snapshot of how one could look at the same data on the basis of not class, but in terms of living standard measures. We can see that if you are in a low living standard measure category, only 37.9% of people were satisfied, compared to those who are living in a high living standard. 68.2 people really feel satisfied with their lives. It's a sharp contrast. Again, you can see the difference between those who see that their lives have improved in the past 5 years And those who have seen their lives have stayed the same, 46% of people in the median. Most of us are in that category. Nothing is, feel that nothing has changed. Oh, sorry, we are in 35%. In the median, 35%. Thank you.
That was perfect timing. You took your 30 minutes. You didn't go over. Just to remind people, we started at 1:45, so we're not behind. Professor Balafo? Well, we are behind, but it's not our fault. Remember to jot your comments and questions down, and we will have the discussion after the second presentation.
All right. Good afternoon, colleagues. I always find it interesting that the linguist in the audience gets the last word, so I hope I live up to my entertainment potential, at least in terms of the my presentation is on the role of language as complicit or contributing to national unity, and some of the questions we've been dealing with in the course of the conversations over the last few days. So I want to just begin with a note of thanks to the Mzala Institute, or the Centre, also to the NRF and the Harry Oppenheimer Memorial Trust for funding the research which is contained in the second book that Lebo made mention of in the introduction. And then some opening remarks. I am a specialist in applied linguistics, particularly within education, so I'm going to be talking about the links between education and its function towards dealing with socioeconomic issues. And the first thing I want to note is that I think we can take as given that the role of literacy in the early years in relation to the performance of our schools, and then also linking to the performance of our higher education sector, has come into the forefront of the national government, also the national media in the last 5 years. It's really become a very pressing issue. And it's become pressing because the schooling sector is seen as routinely underperforming. And that in turn has linked to the underperformance of the higher education sector and the slow throughput, low retention rates in the higher education sector. And my sense, colleagues, is that there is a link. There's a link between poor performance in schools, particularly in the early years, and poor performance later on. And I think that link is a political and economic issue rather than an education issue. I'm going to be talking a bit more about that. And it has a Janus face. It has a two-faced side. And the one relates to a refusal, and I think it's a political and to some extent an economic leadership refusal to consider some of the damaging consequences of our constitutional and legislative frameworks, and how those frameworks allow for class and race differences to become exacerbated, and how those differences play out in the underperformance of schooling and the underperformance of higher education. So there are three questions I want to address with you this afternoon. To what extent has language and all our constitutional rights around language contributed to the delivery of quality education in schooling and universities? So language not only as an issue around diversity and identity, but also as the vehicle through which education is conducted. How has that improved quality? Second question, to what extent has language contributed to social cohesion? And third question, to what extent has language contributed to a transformative understanding of the value of diversity and inclusion? So, Greg, in your talk, you also touched on these notions of what it means to be South African, to be a part of a South African inclusive identity. Is there a crisis? You know, when we talk about post-1995 change, when we look at a 20-year survey of how we've actually done, is there a problem? And I give you three points about the underperformance of schooling, and 2 points about the underperformance in schooling, and 1 point about the underperformance of higher education. So I just want to establish in this room that that we all agree there is a crisis. We all agree that the crisis is long-lived. It's been a 20-year crisis. I think we all agree we can't afford another 20 years of the same kind of crisis. Right? So I think the issues around literacy and liberation in relation to citizenship play into that crisis, because without a performing education system, participation in a democracy also becomes underperforming. Because fewer people are able to be employed, fewer people are able to self-sustain their livelihoods, fewer people are able to access the machinery, the resources, the agencies of the state in order to be part of that democracy. So I think that we can take as given. The other issue is that in South Africa, this crisis around education takes the form of commodities. And what we see 20 years later is that despite constitutional framing around equal education, equal provision of languages, equal access to mother tongue education and so on in the early years, is that 20 years later, good quality education is something you buy. And good quality education is associated particularly with good quality language education. So if you're a parent, I'm sure many of you in this audience are parents or you have children, you'll know that when you choose schools or choose universities, the quality of provision through the language is a key issue for parents. And this has been demonstrated over and over again. There's lots of empirical evidence that one of the key choices parents make when they access good schools is around, is English the medium of instruction or is Afrikaans the medium of instruction, and what is the quality of teaching through that medium? So language as a commodity. Internationally, English is supported by massive press, massive usage, and so no doubts about this. I'm not going to quote any stats around it, but that is through design. It's not accidental that there is this massive support internationally for the use of English. So when we talk about access to mother tongue education in South Africa as an education right, it has to be framed in the context of this massive support for English globally in terms of design. And there is evidence, I think, of resistance in South Africa. Over the last 20 years, there are about 12 lawsuits. I'm sure you would have read about these in Mpumalanga, all these contestations between school governing bodies and departments of education around language as a medium of instruction. And those struggles have mostly been about Afrikaans. Nobody is fighting about the use of isiZulu in schools or isiXhosa. The contest is around the continued use of Afrikaans in some schools. And yet Afrikaans medium schools are less than 10% of all our schools in the country. So my question is, why this heightened contestation around the use of Afrikaans? No attention to the languages, indigenous languages in the country, lots of attention on English. Why is that happening in terms of this issue around language as a commodity? Only recently, in the last 5 years, I'd say, has language become an issue at universities in terms of, again, contestation around Afrikaans. So 20 years later, young black students mostly, young coloured students perhaps, are contesting the use of Afrikaans in 2, 3 maybe, of the 26 universities. So unwittingly then, English becomes both the object of resistance, in other words, the desire for English becomes both a form of resistance by Afrikaans speakers, I'll come back to the role of Afrikaans, and also the object of desire for non-Afrikaans speakers, be they white or black, in those institutions. And that's quite an interesting background to the next series of slides I want to show you. So if we go back, having seen that social context of underperformance, contestation, we go back 20 years and we look at the aims of all our legislation. About 5 or 6 pieces of legislation in South Africa, beginning with the Constitution. There are 6 aims that we can extract from our language education policy, our Constitution, the National Languages Act, and so on. Most of these is that the legislation aspires to the creation of a multilingual citizenry rather than an English-speaking citizenry. It aspires to a multi-literate, in other words, people who can read and write in more than one language, in the home language of primary schools, that's explicitly mentioned. It aspires to the creation of a multilingual learning environment. In other words, schools should be able to support children in a variety of languages in learning, not simply kids talking to themselves, among themselves in their home languages. It aspires to the creation of a multilingual schooling environment. In other words, not the same as a learning environment, a schooling environment in which language policies of schools make provision for multilingualism, right? As part of how the school functions. In higher education, points 5 and 6, the legislation summarizes into these 2 points: multilingual teacher education programs that make support for the provision of multilingual classrooms in schools, and then multilingual higher education is something different from multilingual teacher education. In multilingual higher education, the legislation aspires to institutions, universities, and so on, using more than one language for teaching and learning. And these are 6 points that we can take from the following documents. I've just given you a few of them so that you know I'm not kind of sucking it from my thumb here. Where do I get the evidence for this? And there it is in the Constitution, Provision 6, and there it is in the norms and standards regarding language in the South African Schools Act. You see all of the discourses around parity of esteem, equality of status, cultural diversity, and promoting of multilingualism. So there's no shortage of official support, if I could put it like that, in the language and education policy, full participation, counter the disadvantages of different kinds of mismatches between home languages. And there it is, colleagues, item 6 is redress. Redress is a critical issue. But what happens? What happens between the aspirations and the realizations in the schools? Over 20 years we see that the transition to English is still made in grade 4 onwards. So children are theoretically, even in schools in Mapumulo or Stanger area, theoretically getting their mother tongue in the first 3 or 4 years, if you include grade R. Then they make the transition, but the higher education system doesn't support the transition because teachers aren't trained to make the transition. And teachers have never been trained to make the transition, ever. So they make the transition to English as a medium, but they're not trained in English. They're not trained to make the connections between English and isiZulu, and they themselves, our teachers, are partial users of English. Where the medium is Afrikaans, subject teachers, where they also make that transition from Afrikaans to English, or they make the transition from English to Afrikaans, subject teachers in those schools are also not trained in the medium, but through the medium. So they are also partial users of English as a medium. And then the third group, the African language speakers, the vast majority of our children do not have their home languages as real choices in the curriculum. So the language, Tshivenda, Setswana, might be offered among those subjects in the high school, but it's not offered as the content area of any other subject. Right? And why is that important? Because when you go on to university level, none of those African languages, with the exception of UKZN, are offered as a vehicle for learning and teaching. So I'm just going to come straight to the point with you. We need constitutional and legislative revision at this stage in our democracy around language. The underperformance of the education system is the evidence that we have that this revision is now necessary, that equal rights to equal language provision isn't enough anymore. And why is that? Because the last 20 years have been characterized by an absence of political and social will. So the experience of liberation has not to do with being free from Afrikaans, in my view. It should come with the obligation to learn an African language for everybody. And that first dimension also has to do with the absence of political will to really support the languages students are desiring in higher education. So if the desire is for English, then surely, colleagues, we should agree that the support for English should be put in place. And it's not in place. It's not in place nationally, it is in place internationally. And then we have really weak regulatory bodies in this country around language. I mean, PANSOB, I think, was dissolved earlier this year. I mean, 20 years of kind of bumbles around PANSOB and the absence of a language plan, the absence of any coordination around languages planning has led to PANSOB's dissolution. So even the so-called, what are they, Chapter 9? What are those bodies called? Those statutory bodies around our rights are not really functioning in relation to languages. Problem number 2 is the status of African languages. Now, status can't be just symbolic. No point in talking in the Constitution that every learner shall have the right to mother tongue education through the medium of his or her own language and so on, unless you support it with material power. So symbolism, symbolic status without material support is fairly useless. So this second dimension around the status of languages in higher education relates to the actual function. So no point in not using an African language and then having mention of it in the Constitution. If you're going to have African languages anywhere in the legislation around education, they've got to be used in schools and universities alike. The use of Afrikaans is often the example when you talk over coffee or over your drinks, we talk about the success story of Afrikaans. But it's not a success worth repeating in South Africa because the price for non-Afrikaans speakers around the successful use of Afrikaans was higher than the language was worth in terms of national unity, diversity, respect for difference, and so on. It's not an example worth repeating. But not using African languages creates another kind of impact. If we don't use African languages, what we see occurring in our universities is race polarization. So when you remove Afrikaans from Stellenbosch, you don't deal with the racial tensions and divisions at Stellenbosch through English. English does not provide for that either because it's not an African language. So with an only English policy, ladies and gentlemen, when we go for this straight for English in schools, straight for English in universities, does the polarization disappear? No. It actually deepens. Why does it deepen? Because what's revealed when you remove Afrikaans is that there is a very deep-seated, and Greg noted it in relation to his measures concerning trust and mistrust, there's a very deep-seated sense of cultural alienation in those higher education institutions. And that's why students are protesting about not being welcome, not feeling welcome, not being accommodated within Western epistemologies around how knowledge is constituted or put together in degree forms, for example, what counts as knowledge. So take out the language issue around Afrikaans, and the deeper issues come to the surface. Third problem, English is a failed lingua franca. In the Constitution, English is framed as one of the 12 official languages. We all know it's not just one of the 12. It is, in fact, the lingua franca, the language of record, whether officially designated or not. That is the language that South Africa conducts its business in, its administration in, its education in, and so on. But it's an unenviable position because if it's not the official lingua franca, it can't claim the language as a language, has no access to the resources necessary to be able to be made accessible for the majority of people. And what do I mean in that? So while we enable people to choose a straight for English policy in schools because SGBs can do it, and while we say that even you might even want to go from English from grade 1 or grade R, because parents think it's going to give them better chance of success, their children. What provision is provided for English support in the state's teacher education programs? There's none. So if I'm a history teacher or a science teacher, I'm not taught how to use English as the language of science or history. And yet the majority of my children in the classrooms are not first language speakers of English. So what are we doing? We're kind of manufacturing the crisis of underperformance. We're manufacturing it ourselves. We're doing it to ourselves. And then when you don't make provision for English in that official way, ironically, this is a paradox, the role of African languages is even more diminished. So what we see in our schools from grade R onwards is that teachers are now going for, forget the mother tongue. I can give you a few surveys around this. Forget mother tongue instruction. Let's all go for English from grade 1. And so what little chance there was for African languages to have 3 or 4 years of development is now sacrificed for English. But the teachers cannot teach the language because they weren't trained to teach it. So I think we're really kind of happily muddling along in our own chaos in this way. And I come to the conclusion of my paper. I call this, what happens when the unintended marry the unwitting? Now, if you're entering into a marriage, you've got to know you're the fiancé or you're the intended or whatever. You're the intended bride, right? And the unwitting is what happens when you react to an unintended consequence. So now when you put together this unintended marriage with the unwitting partner, what kind of relationship do you build? So the consequences are these. Low numbers of black and white graduates in scarce skills because the education system underperforms. It underperforms particularly in those areas like science and maths where language is absolutely critical, especially if you're a second language speaker. Language is critical to success in those fields, especially if you're a second language speaker. Unwittingly in schools, we compel this transition to English earlier because we think it'll provide a better foundation. But unwittingly, that transition erodes whatever provision was going to be made for the mother tongue. And so unwittingly, that undermines English too. Why? Because a child now no longer has a solid foundation in the mother tongue, also has now no solid foundation in English despite having had it for 3 extra years, because the teacher isn't trained to teach in the language. And unwittingly, universities then add to this kind of toxic mix. They then think they can address these problems in the schooling system through foundation phase. I'm sure all of you, I've been through, these foundation programs, these academic literacy programs. But the academic literacy isn't in an African language, which you should have had it as a foundation in the schools. The academic literacy is in English, which you were never taught in schools, through the content area of your subjects. You were taught the history, the geography, the science, but you weren't taught the language of the content as language, not just as content. And then what does that do? It compounds the cycle of race exclusion, race barriers. So the consequence of poor literacy provokes a crisis then. What is the next consequence? It provokes a crisis of confidence in South African teachers and universities. And that's what we see with all the protests. It's not so much about fees, it's about the failure to deliver a quality education in the stipulated time for the people who need it. It is a crisis of confidence. It's not purely a perceptual crisis. It's not purely a material crisis either. And then unwittingly, you get institutions like Stellenbosch, Northwest now to some extent. Let's make English the medium of instruction. Why? Because we think it's going to deal with race and class issues around inclusion. Colleagues, it's just nonsense. Just an absolute nonsense. English isn't going to solve it at Stellenbosch any more than English solved it at Wits or Rhodes. It's a nonsense argument, it has no logic. And then I come to a series of reflections. Now the first one, I think, is that after 20 years, the evidence is overwhelming that there is a link between poor school performance and poor higher education. And language is instrumental in that performance measurement measuring exercise, whether it's the ANA results or the PEARLs or the TIMS or whatever it is. The absence of adequate provision in the indigenous languages has become more marked over time. So the number of children getting a solid foundation in Zulu, Setswana and so on has decreased over time. The number of students enrolling for these languages has decreased over time. This is an unintended consequence of constitutional provision around so-called equality where it doesn't in fact exist. And there are terrible, I think, it's not only ideological, there are terrible economic and political consequences of this horrible marriage between the unintended and the unwitting. More than this, I think South Africa's working class, whether it's black or white, are deeply aware that there is a gap between the promise of a new South Africa and the delivery. And we're all aware, I think, particularly if you have friends, family who are working class members, the system continues to privilege the middle class only. And I think there is a new danger in this toxic marriage, this unintended, unwitting kind of collusion. That when we start talking about equality of jobs, disenfranchisement, freedom, liberation, and so on, the people who are doing the talking about it are also the politicians and the people in power who, in a sense, are perceived as having robbed that language from the dispossessed, the unemployed. The unemployed and dispossessed no longer have access to that language of liberation because they see this language as being working for the top. It is not working for the bottom groups. And in my view, when you lose control over the discourse as a working person, when you feel that the words cannot be heard anymore, or that your meaning can no longer be conveyed in the words anymore, then violent action becomes inevitable. Thank you.
On that very depressing note, I invite back to the table and invite comments and questions.
Thank you for very stimulating papers. I'll start with the first one. And the question is, I quite enjoyed the kind of survey and the results that you showed there. But I was wondering if it would make any difference to pay attention to age group, and if that picture would change. It's depressing, but for a moment if we were to pause and say, the bone freeze or this and that, if it would make any difference, perhaps not. On the second paper, I suppose in South Africa, what has driven most of our successful delivery projects, it has been because those projects have been aligned to restoring dignity. And I suppose we need to elevate, if not language, literacy, to the point where it will restore dignity to all of us. Maybe that once it reaches it gets to that level, I suppose that's the only chance where language and literacy will also be seen as one of the critical areas that can address our social needs. But at the moment, it's shelter and alleviating poverty, as if those are contradictions, as if those cannot, as if language and literacy cannot help in that process. I suppose maybe we need just a small twist that will somehow raise literacy and language as one of the things that can get us out of
Thank you very much for insightful presentations. I've always been intrigued by the issue of language and your conclusions in terms of reflections. The second point where you talk about the marked decline or marginalization of African languages. I would be interested to know if you've done any research about African people's attitudes to their own languages, because I think that's where the problem lies. I'll tell you why I say so. Two things that I have noted over the years. One is that the provincial government in Limpopo wanted to introduce African languages as the medium of instruction there. And the people who were up in arms were African people themselves. They said, no, we don't want that, we want English. And then, of course, I think if I'm correct, in 2012, the Department of Arts and Culture introduced a law that every department and state-owned entity should have a language unit so that when government talks to the people, it talks to them in their own languages. Now, all these departments largely have got African leaders, right? But there seems to be reluctance in terms of getting that off the ground. It's not happening. And there's this perception that, well, what are they going to do with these African languages? They don't open up opportunities for them to get jobs, etc., etc. And yet, with this latter development of African languages, it actually opens up opportunities for African language specialists. And I think those are the two things that I wanted to maybe present to you. And you tell us about the attitude of Africans, because I think the problem lies there. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just make it very brief. It's a quick but broad question. Between 1990 and 1993, South Africa, or the South African leadership at the time, the government in waiting, made decisions on a number of cases. I will identify two. One, for quite some time, we were saying that we were not going to embrace the institution of traditional leadership. But there was a change of mind, particularly in 1993, at a conference that was held just outside Pretoria. And I've since written a piece providing 5 reasons why I think the decision was made. But now, the question to the two presenters is that we are saying transformation has not moved at the pace at which we expected. And then in this case, also Prof. Palfa is saying that we have a crisis in education. Then my question is, had South Africa not decided to change from a socialist perspective, would we still be facing this problem?
The last comment.
Greg, you my man. You made my day. I also spent about 20 years in the Colored Townships. I was in Newlands East. You know what's happening in Wentworth, I know what's happening in Greenwood Park, in Sydney, right? So now, as you can see, when you look at me, you will see that I got this hairstyle of the big head, right? I leave it like that purposely, for the sake that they misidentify me. Sometimes I cut my hair, I'll keep my people, which are African, will keep on greeting me in English, and I don't like that. They confuse me. So I was well treated when I was in the Colored Township for about 20 years, but the only problem, the neighbors, they knew that I was an African. Only them knew. So the others outside didn't know. So all what you have experienced, the talking, the using of the K words, it used to happen while I'm there, because they didn't know that, okay, this one is on this side, right? So, but 24 hours, really, you can give up. I don't blame you if you say you have given up. Because 24 hours, you know how the perception of those people got colored. Yeah? You were even better, of course, you are in Wentworth. In Wentworth, they speak the Zulu, the colors of Wentworth. And you know, you're from Cape Town, right? You know their Zulu is the closer line a little bit, right? But in Newlands East, where you got those that know Zulu, it's nothing. Zulu is nothing. Even the colors from Wentworth, they go to Newlands, they say, what kind of people are they? Don't speak Zulu. What think they are? Because they just don't speak Zulu. Meanwhile, they know. They can be deep colored, with long hair, straight hair, but they know they're Zulu. They speak Zulu like I'm speaking it. But they'll pretend they don't know it. But the problem, other problem, which I was given by, I like what I was given by, when it comes to this race thing, it was given by a white person. I won't mention, because many of them, they know it. She's from the UKZN, as I'm from UKZN. She did say that, But the problem in South Africa about race is that race is legalized by the government. Because you can see even whatever happens, if they race, color, whatever, is there, it's slotted there. Meanwhile, in other countries that are trying to fight race is about say color is anybody but white. Anybody but white is colored, right? Depending, even myself, I've been admitted to the hospital in London. They didn't ask for me who I am, but they will write my card colored just because of complexion. Right? Not that I take a certain race, you black anyway, but it's a different story in South Africa. As you pointedly said, giving some points that, some facts that even with the government employment, 70% is colored. Rightly so. I even talk to my peers sometimes. I said, you know, you'll be good if I can take you to Newlands East, because you know Newlands East is hilly, something like that, and you can't park your car inside. They don't come inside. I said, I can take you to Newlands East and see during in the evenings how many cars are parked on the road, and you can feel that these people are well educated in this area. Meanwhile, it's just because of the race. So they are given high positions just because of their race. And I got a problem with this race in South Africa. Because as you come from Cape Town, you know, we got this Khoisan, right? Now so most of the times, no, the Khoisans are not talking for themselves. Someone is talking for the Khoisans. It means now they are being used, these people, but they are abused. Meanwhile, they are paid because you know what happens in the history, how their ancestors were being molested there. And you find that in Cape Town, there's Helen Zid. Do I talk Helen Zid? Patricia Dillon. Patricia Dillon. Yes, Patricia Dillon is a color. Yes, fine, no problem with that, right? There comes the guys, the Khoisan, they marching. Patricia Dillon is leading that march again. She's Khoisan now. So please, Khoisans are Africans, we're pure Africans. But they didn't come from heaven. They also came from Central Africa. But they came from Central Africa. They're Africans like other Africans. Right? So thanks very much for what you have said. Thanks very much.
And let the two speakers respond to the 4 comments.
Thank you. You know, the born freeze. It is a serious challenge. I'm by interest, political historian, and my interest is the history of the liberation struggle. It is absolutely dismal. About the knowledge about the history of the struggle is dismal. The interest is there. When I go with some of the projects I have to interview people who are involved in the struggle, you cannot imagine how those eyes just light up. And when they sit in those interviews, they enjoy it. But they don't have the content of the history of the struggle. And I recently wrote a paper on, I analyzed the struggle history as well. The born frees are somewhat different. I mean, there's something that, and we are not playing our role because we are losing this generation. There is someday, unfortunately, the person always wears it different hats. As a supporter of the ANC, you're also thinking about this thing of the ANC. And in the future, we are going to have these people who are not interested in politics. They're not interested. So I don't see, my purpose behind this paper is merely that I'm reflecting around the issue of race and the responsibility that I think people of where I come from, and the role that we need to be playing in our communities. We need to be conscientizing people, but you cannot do it without the support of organization. And the ANC in Wentworth was just useless. They were there only once a year, just to come and fetch me to vote for them, to stand in, to become in the executive. And yet it has a fundamental role to play. It could really, really liberate people's minds. Because the ANC is ruling in Tegwini. Now you elect a DA councillor, that guy is just getting a salary. Nobody listens to him. Now to explain this to people, that this is what you do. They see the logic. But the minute you stand in that queue, you cannot imagine the racist comments. I sat in that queue in the elections 2011. And unfortunately, the ANC guys were trying to put up some little tent and they were failing. And these were colored guys. But the racist comments in that queue. And I can bet you not one of those people understand what the TA stands for. They have no idea what the TA stands for. Even some of them might not be able to say it's a democratic alliance. It's just bad. But I'm saying we need to deal with this as an organizational and beyond that, the networking that needs to be done. Because the Western Cape is going back. And the Western Cape was ANC, and there was a strong UDF. And actually, the remains of it is still there. There are people who have fond memories and still retain those strong relationships because of 1976, where they could run into houses in Agro, in Langa, and so on. The relationship between people across the race is very strong from that era. But it is just not there now. Nobody is even thinking of organizing the working class, the colored working class. They go into Langa, and so on. On the second issue, I think, Robert, I would have to see if the HSRC has done a survey on language, attitudes to language. There might be something about language. I don't want to talk about traditional leaders. We can talk about that.
I think the point made at the back about language in relation to dignity is an absolutely critical one. And it's critical in our education project because irrespective of what people think about African languages and irrespective of the low status of African languages, and that is reflected in the HSRC work as well, fact of the matter is that the vast majority of households are not English first language households in South Africa. And the education system has got to begin from that basis. It's got to begin from that basis because in an environment where there are not sufficient mother tongue speakers of a language, the only way in which you're going to acquire a new language is on the basis of really understanding your own language. Even if you think it's the most useless language in the world, your cognitive abilities to acquire a new language depend on the excellent development of your home language. The Constitution and our education legislation doesn't articulate that clearly enough. It's not clear. Why has there been low status associated with African languages? Because within a constitutional framing which allows choice for non-African languages, which have this enormous international support, or in the case of apartheid Afrikaans, this history of material advantage over hundreds of years, those languages will always seem to be a better choice in terms of social mobility inside the country as well as outside the country, because we allow for those choices to be made. We allow for those choices to be made in our legislation. Becky, to come to your question around socialism, would things have been different in a socialist world with a socialist agenda? I want to link that to the aspirations around equal education in South Africa, because I think those fundamentally have a socialist flavor to them, if I could put it like that. They're influenced by that kind of thinking. And that provision, socialist provision for languages, would make it mandatory that in order to participate in a multilingual, diverse South Africa, you need more than 2 languages. And why do I say more than 2 rather than just 2? Because if you're Afrikaans, you're going to have had English anyway. And you still won't be able to participate in a South Africanness beyond those 2 colonial languages. you won't be able to participate. So for everybody else, 2 languages. For Afrikaners, 3 languages at higher education level as choices. That for me that, Becky, speaks to equitable language provision, which is enabling of your home language, it's enabling of your language of the institution or the school or the university, whatever it is, and it's enabling of cultural diversity, dealing with the race divisions in the country and so on. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the playing fields aren't level. Playing fields aren't level in our country, and so if you're white and English, what do you have to learn? Nothing. Nothing. If you're black, you have to learn English, no choice. And if you're black wanting to access quality education that happens to be in Afrikaans because it's the only school in your area that offers quality education, now you're having to do the Afrikaans and the English, and yeah, it's not an equal playing field. And therefore, unwittingly, the levels of participation across race groups, across languages, is damaged. It's damaged. So, 2 very practical suggestions arising from our 20 years of like spectacular disaster, I think, around languages. Designate a lingua franca, controversial as it might be, as English. And make compulsory the use of African languages in higher education so that the teachers and the academics and the graduate students are developing that high-level competence in African languages so that at the children's level you have literate parents teaching literacy in the home to literate African children.
We have time for another set of questions, but if you could please keep the comments and the questions short so that we can get a little bit more into the discussion. Any other comments?
Thank you. Very interesting papers. I know the focus was on language and on race, but I would like to hear your thoughts on how the language problem, and this is to Robert, how the language problem within the emerging middle class and urban black community in South Africa, how that is troubling the already existing class relations.
I couldn't see any other hands.
Thank you. Indeed, interesting papers. I would like to ask you, which I think both presidents they can answer. But Greg, you mentioned an important point in Mzala's argument around how do we resolve the national question, which is integration and equality. Probably let's do the other way around. So, like equality and integration, which so with the, I suppose the compromise solution that we had, which obviously has not necessarily taken us there, which links also obviously to the arguments by Professor Balfour around language. So, in this instance, how then do we go back to, in terms of struggles or mostly, let's say, the kinds of intellectual engagements and let's say popular struggles that are going to take us back to programs that are pushing
firstly, equality, that probably then will lead to integration. Yeah. That then probably you might deal with the issues that you are addressing around the accentuation of minority identities.
Again, the issue of language, I think when it comes to Robert, you did mention that there was this promise of New South Africa, but when it came to delivery, it was another story. Because in my age, maybe, I don't know if Mrs. B was around that during that era, but we were taught in Zulu, those in Zulu areas, in Zulu, in Xhosa, from the primary education until standard 6, or standard 6 was the external, the primary school. What used to happen as an African child, by the time you meet your matric level, already have done extra classes. There was this extra class for us, which at the later stage, standard 6 was phased out until standard 5 now, which is grade 7, grade 6 or whatever. So now it ends there, now then you go to the. So you were taught in Zulu from the beginning until standard 6. English would come as a subject, Afrikaans would come as a subject. There was no problem. Then in the secondary school, high school, then you start, then your English now, everything, but your basic. Don't take away the child, the basic education, because it's innate to the child, the language and the traditions of the child, because the child is lost. You can see so many of our children, when you look at them in the primary level, they're very lost. And most of the time, when we find these children, they're thinking, I've dealt with them, and I've been with them in class. Dr. Mngome Zulus know, but they are lecturers, maybe they don't know what's happening there. You can see the comments of those children. These children that are in the so-called, they go to the suburbs in the morning, live in the township, and they're sleeping, the children in the buses, because they wake up so early and they reach the areas, even the afternoon is the same thing. But those children, yes, I don't know, that education, maybe scientific one, or including science and math, they'll be fine. But those children, really, I can tell you, they will never leave this country. Because they're just foreign. Even the thinking between, you find that the children from the townships, even though now taught in English, but they still got that feel. Even from the villages, they still got that feel. You can see that, okay, this can lead this. But that other child, it's just foreign, will come from there and think that you will lead South Africa. That is really, but the main thing, again, government failing to deliver, but talking. Because this thing now, where the problem started, is this. I like when you said, Greg, you won't go talk about this thing of the chiefs, because you know what's in here. You know, the imposed chiefs who used to be homeland leaders, they imposed this thing of the children learning in English. They are the ones, because this apartheid government did say that, okay, now we've spoken to your leaders everywhere, because spoken to leaders, but referring to the homeland leaders, that, okay, now they've agreed that you start from level 1 with this thing with English now. No more your languages now. Then they were phased out. And all the terms, everything, the scientific terms, they're there in the archives, just to bring them back. Thank you.
Thank you. I do know a little bit about the history of traditional leadership. I conducted a project here where we interviewed lots of Amakosi. I think one of the most embarrassing things about them, they couldn't remember the names of their daughters. A lot of them, even young Amakosi. It was embarrassing. I mean, the guys were embarrassing. But it was 3, 4 children, and you couldn't remember the names of your daughter, one daughter. And you're 24, 30 year or 34 year old man. Was a lawyer, by the way. I remember one case. But yes, I think you phrased the thing right. It's equality before integration. And that's why I think Mzala said socialism is the way, the solution. Under the current circumstances, I mean, you're asking me to answer the questions I said that the Mzala said should be answered. But I think I'm going to answer another question. should we just push ahead aggressively with programs to enforce equality without consideration for sensitivities around social contracts structured things over it? That is one option. Can we do that? The other one, of course, socialism is the answer. And that's what, to answer that question is to answer Schubin's question that was posed to the Institute. So these are the questions that the center has to start discussing, maybe with a number of us, included as well.
Yeah, the language and middle class identification is becoming more interesting, particularly in relation to the burgeoning black middle class and the access that that class has to the commodity of high quality education. Remember, I started talking about commodification of language, and English particularly comes to be seen as a highly prized, as indeed in China or in the United Arab Emirates. English is a highly prized commodity. Nevertheless, Jenny, in terms of the development of a South African identity to which all of us, to some extent, are able to access equal education, irrespective of class, depends on access to more than simply English as a middle class, highly prized commodity. And there is no way, the demographics just don't allow it, that we can't afford to think of it in that way. In other words, we can't afford to think of English as a commodity accessible only to the middle class, which then integrates using English in schools in which English is a medium of instruction. So the race, culture, identity issues in these middle class schools using English are of a different kind to, for example, the race language issues at universities where not all students come from middle class backgrounds. So the people who are protesting at universities about language, I'd be interested to know whether those are middle class students or not. And that for me ties into the point I'm trying to make about why indigenous language development or African language development is not simply an ideological choice. I mean, the demographic makes it absolutely necessary that high levels of skill be developed in African languages for higher order thinking in higher education. Until we do that, it's only middle class English that enables success in higher education. And that elite is entrenched in the school system, they're entrenched in the higher education system. And the people who are dropping out are the people who are protesting and not getting through, and they don't have access to that commodity. So what do they have access to? Let's assume they have access to Zulu and Setswana and isiXhosa and so on in the home. That's what they have access to. Or a mixture of those languages. And then we have to ask, well, why is it that our education system isn't building on that? Why are we not building on that from the foundation phase right through the education system? Because that's what people have. So there's a kind of a self-immolation when people hurt themselves by making choices which they think are going to take them further, but which actually lead to a further type of incarceration. And then what do we do with the middle class kids in these rich schools where they can afford this middle class English that guarantees success in later life? How do they get to participate as equals with other children, not from the middle class? How are they going to do it? They're certainly not going to do it through middle class English. They're going to do it through African languages. That will remain the link that will bridge class divides. But to do it, the state has to put so much more behind teaching teachers to use African languages in a multilingual environment. And that's what we don't do at present. I mean, even the last, I think it was a study undertaken by JET, which is a fairly conservative joint education trust. Even the last survey of teacher education programs showed that there wasn't enough English literacy being developed in foundation phase. There was hardly any African language literacy being developed for the foundation phase teachers. So the new graduates, new teachers graduating from the system in the last 20 years can't teach English properly. They did a test, a basic test, I think over 70% of them got really poor results. And in the home language, there was just nothing.
Yes, I would like to thank my colleagues very much and the audience for being a wonderful audience. And obviously the questions, there remain more questions than answers, and so we're looking to the Mzala Nxumalo Center to continue leading us, to continue leading us in asking and trying to deal with these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are now going to have a summary of the colloquium, and we hand over now to the John Pampalis, who's the chairperson of the Mzala Nxumalo Center Board, to take us through 2 days of deliberations and presentations and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Look, I'm very much aware that I'm standing between you and your lunch, and between me and my lunch, which is just as important. So I don't think it's going to be useful to summarize what everybody said. We've all heard the papers. So I just want to kind of make a few points. I think the program says I must thank as well as summarize. So I would just want to start off by thanking everybody who's participated in the conference as a presenter, as a member of the audience. It's not really an audience because people have participated from where they are as well. So thank you very much. I can't remember the last conference I went to, or last colloquium I went to, where every session was equally interesting. I mean, that amazes me. I didn't actually expect it, because you seldom get it. And I'm very pleased about that. I just want to make a few points, though. First of all, it was useful to have, most of the presentations focused on specific problems, specific issues, specific challenges. But I think it was useful to have a few context, or at least two context papers. You gave us an overview and told said this is the framework in which we're working. Rasigan Maharaj's kind of long view of the last, God knows how many years, 17,000 years or something. And his point that in the latter years, and particularly since the development of capitalism, we've experienced great environmental degradation, and he links this directly to the capitalist system. I'm not sure if it's exactly like that, because the social societies we've had have also made their contribution to environmental degradation. We also had then, the other kind of overview really was Shubin's really kind of insightful an analytical presentation which ranged over a wide range of issues. And that helped us, I think, to see the world from a different perspective to the one we normally see it. And that was, I think, very useful. You also made the point that we actually know in South Africa, we know very little about Russia. And also the Russians know very little about South Africa. And we need to start building these links. And I want to tell you, it's not going to be an easy issue. In the last BRICS academic forum I went to, and also talking with academics generally, people are keen to develop interactions with India, with China, with Brazil, but there's a certain reluctance, I sense. People don't say we don't want to develop relations with China, but you can sense that they want to keep that somewhere on the side. And that's the result of decades and decades of Cold War propaganda, that's carried forward with us. And I think we do need to try to remedy that. Okay, there's many papers where there were commonalities, where different issues were dealt with, the similar issues were dealt with from different perspectives. Now, what are some of these issues? One of them is international relations. And I think the paper that we opened with, Eddie Maloka's one, he urged us to think more like Africans, to think of South Africa as part of the African continent. We often don't do that. If I could just tell one anecdote, even if it takes us a bit further. I was in exile in Tanzania, and there was a lady, an old lady from South Africa, who'd been in the struggle for decades, and she had children in the struggle in exile. And so she came out to visit her kids once. And she went to the UK. No, she didn't go to the UK. She went to Zambia to see one of the children. She came to Tanzania and to visit another one. And I was talking to her once, and I said, "Where are you going from here?" She says, "No, I'm going to see my son in Mozambique. And then when I finish with Africa, I'm going back home." This was the consciousness of somebody deeply involved in the struggle. And I think, too, very important was Ivo Mandaza's very interesting paper, which showed us how much we are out of touch with happening in the continent. He made an analysis of what's happening in the continent, and this has got important implications for us, but we're not really studying those things. And for example, he spoke about the securocrat state in Zimbabwe. And maybe there's elements of that in South Africa too. During the paper, the Minister was sitting here next to me, and he said, "Yeah, we've got to be careful of this because there's elements of that creeping in here." And rather frightening, he spoke about the possibility of civil war right on our borders, which is something which will affect us as well. There was another interesting international relations issue, and that was Becky's issue of the export of democracy. And really looking at democracy as not just something which is good for everybody. I mean, the kind of democracy that is being proposed by the Western countries, but it's also an instrument of power. It's an instrument that is used to exercise power over others. We also heard issues of Eurocentrism. Shubin spoke about this, Eddie Maloka spoke about it, Pastor Marad spoke about it, and in other ways, Freddie Mnyongani, he spoke about it in relation to the law and the African, was it the traditional law? The customary law, yeah, customary law. Then the issue of inequality came up again and again and again, as did poverty and inequality. And it's, a very important issue facing us in South Africa. But in a way, I'm not saying people did this here. We often hear this identified as an issue, in political party documents and so on. And of course, there's inequality poverty, unemployment. But the question is, identifying the issue is not enough. You know? The question is, so what if there's all these things? If you speak to the Freedom Front Plus, you think they'll disagree with you that these are problems. They won't. They'll say, yes, these are big problems in South Africa. We need to solve them. The question is how we solve them. And I think that as time goes by, we need to be paying more and more attention to that. Issues of racism and gender came up on a number of occasions. Holly Lewis gave us like a really interesting paper on the situation in the United States and made us realize that issues of racism in the US were just as bad as they have been in South Africa. And also about its relationship to issues of gender and how discrimination and oppression based on race is made worse by gender as well. You know? It can be made worse. Cuban mentioned in passing that we haven't really dealt with issues of class as much. So by saying that, of course, he dealt with the issue of class, but not in much detail. I think that's another thing we have to look at. Then the national question was another important thing that Greg Houston dealt with in quite a lot of detail. But others also dealt with it in many ways. Freddie dealt with it in relation to law, and Robert Balfour in relation to language, and others in various ways. I think, though, there were just last thing I'd like to say, there's some gaps I'd like to note. One of the purposes of holding this conference was to assist in rekindling left thinking in the universities. It's a sad thing to say, but the left thinking and Marxist and socialist political analysis was stronger in the 1980s under apartheid than it is now. These were the kind of last days of apartheid, of course, and they couldn't control everything, but it's become weaker, actually. But I think what we need to look at, though, now, as we try to strengthen it, is what is the left? What is left these days? Conditions have changed, and the left may be something different. The left has traditionally been associated with thought and action, which is looking for, which seeks to get a more equal society in every way. How do we do this? This is the issue. And the left has many traditions, and I think we need to look at all of them. Most of the left traditions, they've got Marx as their source. Whether it's the communist movement, the social democratic movement, the Trotskyist movements, Maoism, and how it's developed in China. Of course, all these have got other influences as well, but they start from Marx. And I think we need to kind of understand where the left is now and what is left. Because although they may have started with Marx, they've certainly diverged. In a discussion of the left and of imperialism and things like this, I think one gap has been a failure to identify the apparent growth of left-wing movements in the developed countries. I mean, I think of the movement in the Labour Party in Britain, which brought Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of that party, and the Bernie Sanders movement around him in the US, and he calls himself a socialist. And for someone to call himself a socialist and actually get votes in the United States is quite surprising. The issue of class struggle, Shubin also pointed out, hasn't really been dealt with too much. We haven't really dealt with it. And as we do this, we need to look at what this means and what it means within a changing class structure. Class is not what it used to be. The industrial working class that Marx identified, is a much smaller class, and it's actually been declining. Certainly in South Africa, it's been declining, and it's been declining in most parts of the world, except possibly China, which produces everything we use now. You know, our shirts, our trousers, our tablecloths, our tables, our cars, everything. So maybe they've had a rising industrial proletariat, but even China's now reached a stage where they're moving towards the service industry, and the industrial working class is decreasing. So what's happening to that working class? Many of them are unemployed. Many of them have become sort of what's called a precariat, a precarious proletariat. People who make their living in all sorts of different ways. You know? People who barely survive, who sell sweets on the corners, who grow a few crops, who make their living in all sorts of different ways. And we need to understand how they fit into our society. That grouping may be bigger than the working class in South Africa today. Rural areas are full of people like this, who are not industrial workers, they're not employed workers, but they're making a living somehow. We don't know how they're making a living, but we need to understand that and see what their political role is too. I think that's basically all I have to say, except to just make the point that the discussions here, I think, have been very interesting. They've stimulated all of us, and they shouldn't stop here. The Mzala Center will take forward these kinds of discussions in other ways, in seminars, colloquiums, in publications, and so on. But I hope that it will also be taken forward and that it will grow throughout the country. Please take up these issues, organize seminars, organize conferences in your own institutions. Publish around these issues. Let's try to make this a movement which grows. I'm not saying it started today, it has been growing, and we hope that it will, at least we must make sure that it continues to grow and that we have an impact, in particular on our universities, which are very important institutions and which have become dominated over the last 2 decades by liberal and neoliberal thinking, postmodernism, really, I think, ideologies which are going to take us nowhere. Thank you very much. I think we're waiting for Derek to tell us where we're going to eat to.
Becky just asked me to remind those who still left here that presented papers. We will be sending you an email with a deadline, which I'll follow up on, of the papers to be developed into full papers, because we hope to be publishing these papers in a colloquium proceedings or journal. So you'll receive an email from us. To thank everyone for participating with me to make it run smoothly, I thank you. We're now going to proceed down to the hotel again for lunch. I just want to ask you that when you get down to the lunch area, just to give me 2 minutes. I just need to organize something there, and then we can proceed with lunch. I won't keep you, John, from your lunch for too long. And please make sure that when you leave, you check around your seat that you have everything with you. For those who stayed in the hotel, you have to fill tomorrow, and I'll be here. Some people are leaving us now today. I hope you travel safely. The students as well, thank you very much. You hadn't intended to come today. And yes, you can go on the tour, Stanley. So the students are welcome. Cedric, thanks very much for coming with your books and being outside, and in absentia, Julian and Holly for presenting their books, which is great. And thank you to Professor Shubin and Holly for traveling a long way to come and be with us. We really do appreciate it and feel honored that you came and shared some of your experience with us. and for Ibo, although he couldn't be here, for sending through a paper which I think is going to be a very interesting read. We will be sending to you, the delegates and the present, we'll be sending and circulating the PowerPoint presentations. We will also be circulating the papers at a later stage. We will make the sound, the recording available as well, and there is going to be a DVD produced of the entire event, which we will also give to each delegate. So give us a week or two and you'll be receiving a DVD, etc. of the entire proceedings. So you won't go away saying, oh, I forgot that presentation or that discussion. It will definitely be there. And we'll see you again. I'll see you downstairs. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.